Welcome to episode 10 of the YoJoeShow Podcast. Here are some highlights. Examining geopolitical tensions, media biases, and controversial public opinions in today's world.
From real estate, there are some places that are never for sale.
That's true.
We're sitting in one right now.
The question that's, I guess, at the forefront now, that's with all the trading partners of the United States is, what's this going to look like 5 and 10 and 20 and more years from now?
Indian military attacks. Strategic targets in Pakistan in retaliation.
Claim that isn't true, and the only jet that fell was, I think, this Rafale that had an accident in India. It is a very mountainous region. It's hard to fly
What
there.
is a tomato?
So we have this clip that we stumbled upon. We kept watching over and over again. It has a chef who is in front of a group of children, young children.
Potato? So you think these are potatoes? Not potatoes, though.
Oh, no.
Do you know what this is? No? Who knows what tomato ketchup is? Yeah, that's what it's made
This
out
here
of.
is a perfect example of what the media does to get people to hate Trump. The Vatican asked Pope Francis' funeral attendees to wear all black. Trump wore a blue suit. So that's what the media says, and this is the image they show you, right? Now here's a picture with more context, and you can see how many other people were dressed. I'm zooming in.
That's a real problem, because aside from the damage it causes, which results in things like, people talk about Ozempic face, Ozempic butt. When you start losing the actual muscle in your body, you look like you've been starved, because the essence of what happens on these drugs, part 100-day polling ever, and he's really touting how important that is, and that you better follow the polls, and how important it is to listen to these polls until it's not so important.
Polls this week show Trump has the lowest 100-day approval rating since they started polling 80 years ago. The lowest. Yes.
There was a poll population that has your approval rating lower than any other congressional with 17%. Are you concerned that you may be a liability for your party?
Polls come and go. Our party is united. We're on our front.
Went unnoticed, I think, by many people. But when you hear what he actually says, it's just shocking. We do know that over the last few years, there's been a massive amount. We're talking 300,000 children that were allowed to come into the country and disappeared.
A Swedish professor saying, we can eat dead people, but that's not fast enough. So I think your next campaign slogan has to be this: we got to start eating babies. We don't have enough time. There's too much CO2.
Hey, everyone, and welcome to the YoJoeShow Podcast. Hey, Joe.
Hey, yo, how's it going?
Good. I'm excited to be at episode 10, finally.
Yeah, number 10. All right, that's a milestone. Here we are.
Yeah, so apparently it's been basically just over a month since we've been starting to release these regular episodes, and we're like over 5,500 subscribers. And one of our fans recently mentioned to me that I think 10,000 is the bronze YouTube play button. I didn't even realize that it's so low, and we're basically more than halfway there. So that's pretty cool.
Really, we want to take it one episode at a time, and here we are for this one, right? First of all, welcome back to everyone that's been following us and joining in and commenting, and welcome to anyone that's joining us for the first time.
Yeah, appreciate you guys all, and all of your input and comments are all greatly appreciated as well.
So we have a few things on the lineup today that I want to try to cover. The first one, I think, has to do with some of the elections that have been going on, not here in this country, but around the world, and even to our immediate north in Canada. Maybe we could start there. Do you think that's a good starting point?
Yeah, the victor is Mark Carney after Justin Trudeau, the famous and infamous Playboy-looking Prime Minister of Canada, the son of, I think it was Pierre Trudeau, his father, a previous Prime Minister of Canada, has now been in power for over 10 years. And although he is very good looking and charming as well, he's a little Gavin Newsom style, his governance has been anything but good looking or charming. And yeah, Canada hasn't been doing very well for a long time. It seemed like Pierre Poilievre, who was the conservative competitor, was on the rise, and he was basically gunning for first place. It seemed like it was a guaranteed win for him. as long as Trudeau was still in office. But then Trudeau, so unlike the Democrats who tried to push Biden until the very, very end, even though he was just completely unpalatable, Trudeau at least had the guts to get up and to quit on time in order to organize enough opposition. And they had the internal votes, and Mark Carney won. And now during the general election, he won over Pierre Poilievre. The main reason for that, in my opinion, is because all of Trump's discussions. So for people unfamiliar, Canada is made out of a whole bunch of provinces, and they are fairly loosely associated. So yes, there is a federal government in Canada, but let's just say Alberta probably wants to be another state. The vast majority of Canada's economy comes from Alberta's oil, and they, for a very long time, and they have a very small population. So it's like, why are we funding all the rest of Canada? So they want to be independent for a while. Quebec has, for multiple decades, has been trying to create an autonomous region, its own state. Some wanted to join France, but most wanted just to be Quebecois state. And then British Columbia has lots of opinions and wills to become independent as well. So Canada is this like loosely fractured kind of nation of provinces, and it isn't guaranteed that Canada as a single unified nation will last a very long time. But the one person who generated the most unity amongst all Canadians has been Trump, by him talking about turning Canada into the 51st state and calling Trudeau governor, even though it was a little kind of tongue-in-cheek just to make fun of Trudeau. That really did unify all Canadians, including the right, including the Conservatives and Pierre Poilievre, saying, no, Canada's for Canadians. We are a proud people. We are a proud nation. And that has unified Canadians more than we've ever seen before. And even though Pierre Poilievre was basically pro-Canada and against it becoming a U.S. state, just as strongly as Mark Carney, people just associate Pierre Poilievre because he is right-wing, because he's conservative. He is very similar to Trump in certain aspects, so people associate that with him. So Mark Carney had this remarkable win, even though just a few months ago Pierre Poilievre was gunning for first place, and it seemed pretty likely that he would win. But because Trudeau had the guts to stand down, and the Liberal Party there didn't decide to choose somebody, rather to have proper internal elections, and because this quote-unquote threat from the United States conquering Canada, that really did unify the Canadians, and Mark Carney had this great victory. And he does seem fairly competent. He was the former chairperson or president of the Bank of Canada, so he does have a financial background, and he isn't unfamiliar to Canadians. But yeah, he did a good job on the debate, and he scored a big victory. Joe, what are your thoughts on the topic as a much older Canadian than I am?
Yeah, definitely older. I was around during the time of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, father, and he was quite a figure. In fact, in some ways, he was Trump-esque in his boldness towards the end of his reign in Canada. He was a unifying guy who, basically because of being able to be fully bilingual and tried to, for those that don't know, Canada does have a dichotomy of the English and French population there. And Pierre Elliott, I think, did a very good job of trying to bring people together. I actually bumped into him once after he left office in downtown Montreal and just exchanged pleasantries. Everyone always figured one day his son would climb pretty high in political office. And of course, he rose to be prime minister.
Well, he didn't really climb through the ranks, more like he went from teacher to prime minister.
I don't think anyone would argue against the obvious that his father's name played a big role in that. People always felt he was the heir apparent one day, that he would be in that role, and he did eventually go there and stay there for quite some time.
And he screwed things up like most heir apparents do.
Ultimately, it was the decision of Canadians, and unlike in the United States, it's a little different. Typically, the party leader is the one that runs the country. So ultimately, when there was finally a lot of pressure for him to step down, they needed a new prime minister, and that's ultimately what the election was called. And I agree that the unifying sort of opposition against the notion of the feared erasing of Canada's identity by Trump repeatedly talking about Canada as being the 51st state certainly did unify people and might have caused some decisions to be made as to who to vote for. That being said, Canada is in a pretty bad financial predicament, and it's been for a long time. Many of the policies and decisions made, I haven't looked recently, but a year ago, 2 years ago, the median home in Toronto, a large Canadian city, was like over $1 million. So taxation's high. For a lot of people, just access to basic goods and the idea of buying a home and having the Canadian dream, just like the American dream, might have really become out of reach for many Canadians. And I think that's the challenge. Regardless of who you have in office, they have to bring solutions and they have to really reflect on what's happened during the most recent Trudeau's control of politics in Canada. What are they going to do? Are they going to continue along the same line? Are they going to make some changes? The notion that Canada relies heavily on the United States is, I mean, it's real. Canadians recognize that the defense of Canada, although there's a great Canadian military with terrific training, there's not a lot of budget for equipment. So if Canada ever really needed protecting, the United States is the one that we all understand would protect Canada. Canada sells its goods to the United States. And now the question is, are there goods that are being exchanged between the two countries that the United States is saying we no longer need to buy your goods? We certainly don't need to manufacture cars in Canada and so forth. I think there's going to be some changes happening in the next year or two as politics evolve and decisions are made with regards to trade. The dust will settle after the election, and then we'll see. At the end of the day, any elected official has to perform, and that's what Canada desperately needs. There are, I agree, people within Canada that perhaps have always questioned whether their province was maybe better off in some other capacity other than being a Canadian province. Quebec attempted to separate from Canada several times, even when I lived there, and they had referendums which they narrowly lost on the idea of separation. They came up with something called sovereignty association, which would be like more a territorial sort of area within that's separate from Canada, but still having the same currency and so forth. But that being said, I think to anyone that maybe isn't familiar with all that, the notion that maybe there is an interest by some Canadians to be part in some way of the United States really is not unheard of. And we'll see where all this plays out. We want all the best for Canada. And certainly, whichever way best works out for both our countries is really the most important thing. But it's interesting to watch as elections progress, both in Canada and they are in other countries as well.
Yeah, mentioning another country, another Anglosphere country that recently had elections was Australia, and the election results there were a little surprising as well, because the Prime Minister Albanese, who's been the previous Prime Minister for the past few years, Anthony Albanese, he didn't just win the elections again, he basically crushed his opposition, and it was anticipated to be a tight race, but I think he changed the majority from like 78 to 87 or something of the party. This does provide Australia with a little political stability. Recently, there was like a revolving door of leaders. There were over 6 prime ministers in the last 18 years. So this can potentially allow him to shape policy more like John Howard did in the early 2000s. This also reflects anti-Trump sentiment, just a rejection of Trump-inspired politics, mirroring Canada's recent elections as well, where the Conservatives were beat by the Liberals. Except here, it was Albanese again winning re-election. I was surprised. Basically, I was not impressed by Albanese over the past few years. Just anything I came across was of his decisions or his speaking points were not impressive, aside from the fact that kind of the AUKUS and the fact that they're buying U.S. nuclear submarines. That sounds like a smart idea. But most other policies of his, again, I haven't been following Australian politics very closely, but it did not seem very inspiring. So I was definitely taken by surprise by this recent election there. What do you think?
Yeah, again, there was a lot of movement in Canada to move in the other direction politically, and now it's much of the same. You wonder sometimes, people also oftentimes might feel more comfortable just continuing what they know rather than going into the unknown. You mentioned all the changes in Australian politics, John Howard, and so forth. Ultimately, stability often is good, but if things are going the wrong way, then you wonder what the electorate's going to do. Are they going to choose a different direction? Certainly, like in the United States, the country went in a very different direction in a very large way, but that doesn't always happen. I think when talking about the importance of these things, certainly back to Canada, given it's our neighbor and we're so strategically tied to Canada, I think it's interesting. We do have some clips we can play that talk a little bit, or maybe give us some reason to pontificate on the interaction between the newly elected Prime Minister of Canada and Trump, and ultimately where things may or may not be going. I think I'd like to put that up just again to just continue on in this sort of talk of the importance. And there's going to be some big changes, I think, coming that have to be negotiated through between us and Canada. We're looking at things in two different ways right now. And 51st state aside, there's some things Canada's going to have to sort out. Let me bring that up. I think this clip actually has several pieces to it, but it puts context into what we're talking about.
Yeah, of course, with NAFTA now being renegotiated, there's a lot of room for wiggle, and we'll see here in this clip, not everything the Canadians want to manufacturers are items that Trump wants to buy from the Canadians. So let's give this a watch.
So it starts off with the Prime Minister arriving to meet President Trump, and the clips are tied together. These are from MTL only, which is Montreal only, it's another great channel if you want to check out what's happening in Canada in and around Montreal. We have a Fox News clip, and then Turning Point Action rounds us up for us to have our discussion. Let's listen to it. Making hands, smiles, people, speaking pleasantries. Then there'll be media.
Tariffing Canada, is there anything he could say to you in the course of your meetings with him today that would get you to lift tariffs on Canada?
No.
Why not?
Just the way it is.
What's the first thing? If Canadians don't want it, would you respect that?
Sure, I would. But this is not necessarily a one-day deal. This is over a period of time they have to make that decision. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, if I may. Respectfully, Canadians' view on this is not going to change on the 51st. If I may, as from real estate, there are some places that are never for sale.
That's true.
We're sitting in one right now, Buckingham Palace, that you visited as well.
That's true.
And having met with the owners of Canada over the course of the campaign the last several months, it's not for sale, won't be for sale ever. But the opportunity is in the partnership and what we can build together. We have done that in the past. We are the largest client of the United States. 50% of a car that comes from Canada is American.
This is very friendly. We want to make our own cars. We don't really want cars from Canada. We don't want steel from Canada because we're making our own steel, and we're having massive steel plants being built right now as we speak. We want to be able to do it ourselves. There's no reason for us to be subsidizing Canada. Canada will have to be able to take care of itself economically.
So this obviously occurs in the Oval Office. I should say newly decorated Oval Office, because Trump definitely Trumpified the look of the Oval Office. There's a whole lot more gold than there was previously. It almost looks a little bit like the Kremlin, but it definitely looks like something that is Trump related. Yeah, Mark Carney, you see how he kind of jumps in place there. He does stand his ground. He does so respectfully. He caught himself and he was like, respectfully, sorry for cutting you off. Because obviously he learned from Zelensky not to piss off Trump in the Oval Office.
He definitely dressed much better than President Zelensky for the meeting. I have to at least take note of that and commend him on his choice of attire.
Yeah, 100%. And I did give him respect for saying, I just spoke to the owners of Canada in reference to the Canadian people. There's a dichotomy. Many times politicians tend to see themselves as the leaders, as the owners, as the representatives, but not just representatives, as the actual leaders and decision makers and owners of their country, when in reality, what they should be remembering is that the voters are the owners of their country. And that was just a little respect for Carney for mentioning that. And like he said, the Canadians are very determined now to stay united as Canada. I don't know if that's necessarily going to last, because the internal rifts are not going to disappear because Trump used to mention a 51st state. I have a feeling that may halt or cease, or we won't see that as common. He was actually asked about during this event, he was asked about calling Trudeau governor, and Trump basically said he did it to play with Trudeau and drive him a little crazy, but he hasn't done that with Mark Carney. So it seems like Trump is learning, and yeah, he gave a lot of respect to Mark Carney. He mentioned a bunch of times how well he performed during the debate, etc. So we're seeing a kind of more respectful side of Trump here. And yeah, I think the conversation went well, but like you said, there's a lot to negotiate during this whole renegotiating of NAFTA. Part of the things are buy Canadian steel, buy Canadian cars, and Trump is like, we don't need your cars, we don't need your steel, we can do it all ourselves. And that's the thing. In terms of economics, Canada's economy is fairly developed, but it is basically a service center for the United States. It's an add-on to the United States. If the United States stops treating them preferentially and purchasing their items because NAFTA is no longer there, and if the tax incentives and trade incentives aren't there like NAFTA was for all American manufacturers to move their production lines to Mexico or Canada or elsewhere, then that could damage the Canadian economy drastically. And like you mentioned earlier, the Canadian economy hasn't been doing well for a very long time. So, yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree that, listen, even so, the original NAFTA agreement, North American Free Trade Agreement, and then the USMCA under the first Trump administration, there's obviously an interest, and there'll always be a strong need to have cooperation between Mexico, the US, and Canada with regards to trade. The question that's at the forefront now, that's with all the trading partners of the United States, is what's this going to look like 5 and 10 and 20 and more years from now? What do we want to change? We realized certainly during COVID that we were overly reliant on China for so many things. So the question now is, what other countries are we overly reliant on, and what industries have suffered in the United States that should be producing the goods here? And ultimately, that's what it comes down to. We were manufacturing cars in Canada. When I lived there, the US automakers had plants in Canada and employed a lot of Canadians to manufacture the cars. And I remember joking with someone here when I was still living in Canada, and they were touting their American-made car, and I opened the door and pointed to the label on it. It showed it was made in Ontario, Canada. Look, ultimately, I don't think anyone thinks we're not going to have a strong relationship with our Canadian neighbors. The question is going to be, what long-term benefits both countries? And there really is a question economically for Canada. What will their future viability look like under the current trade system that they have? And given that, for those that don't know, Canadian provinces, kind of like you described earlier, they're somewhat different than a state in the United States. Provinces, just like I, of course, concede that every American state has its own identity and personality, and some are more right-leaning, some are more left-leaning. We have different favorite foods and so forth, and music, perhaps. But in Canada, certainly provinces, territories, there are real differences. And traditionally, there's been some provinces that have always questioned, really, if Canada as a federal entity was taking advantage of the resources they had. Coming back to the United States, Quebec, for one, provides a lot of hydroelectric energy. There's a massive dam in Hudson's Bay, and it generates a lot of electricity, clean electricity. It's coming from water basically going over a dam, and provides power to much of the northern United States. And no one's saying that's going to stop, although there was a certain Ontario premier that did hint at cutting off power to the US not that long ago, a few months ago, during all this political talk. But at the end of the day, that's not the goal. The goal is to find the most viable, successful outcome for both countries. And I think we do need to keep an eye on what's going on, and we want the best for Canadians, and maybe there is something different in the future as to how we interact with Canada. But I think for right now, perhaps some of the 51st state discussions might be put on hold.
Yeah. And from Canada and Australia on to another democratic country that had recent interesting developments in their election. Germany recently banned AFD. So just a little bit of context. AFD is a fairly new political party in Germany. I think they're from like 2005. It stands for Alternative für Deutschland, which means an alternative for Germany. So the problem with Germany is that they have a right and a left like most countries do. But in Germany, the right and the left are basically the radical extreme left and the less radical extreme left. Under Angela Merkel, who was the chancellor of Germany for a very long time, she was technically a conservative, but in reality, she was as radically left as you can possibly imagine. She was the one who basically orchestrated this Islamic invasion of Germany and of Europe, and trying to force other European countries to accept migrants, whether they like it or not, etc. And she was not very pro freedom of speech, and there was basically nothing in any of her policies that would make her seem like a conservative or a right wing in any other country we would associate. She's basically very far left, except that she was part of the conservatives. After many years, so since its very initiation, AFD was flagged in Germany as a far-right extremist political party. And it was always curious to me why. They're basically being labeled Nazis and neo-Nazis. And there were a few things that some of the founders had said that may sound a little anti-Semitic, whatever, like from 20 years ago, but it didn't seem anything relevant. And they're always portrayed as the radical anti-Semitic neo-Nazi party. And I was like, wait, let me listen to the leader of AFD and see what she has to say. And I listened to her. It's funny. The leader of the AFD, which is this radical Nazi party, she actually lives in Switzerland, and she's lesbian, married to a wife there. So it's not a right-wing extremist in the typical kind of perception of the term. And I tried to understand. I listened to a few conversations, long-form podcasts with her, and I couldn't hear anything anti-Semitic, any policy she had that was anti-Semitic. In actuality, what we've seen is that this far left, green, red duopoly we've seen, union we've seen in the past of kind of hatred towards Israel and hatred towards Jews in large, she stood against that. And it seemed like she cares very much about the future of Germany, whereas the traditional right and left in Germany don't really care for Germany much. It seems like they care more for the illegal immigrants and the other refugees they've been bringing in rather than the actual people of Germany. I've been told to assume that they're Nazis, to think of them as Nazis, but then when I listened extensively to what they had to say, I couldn't hear anything Nazi about them. They sounded extremely supportive of Israel and understanding of the situation in the war, and I couldn't find anything neo-Nazi about them. So when the mainstream media keeps on telling me Nazis, it's wait, maybe not. And it really does seem like this is the only hope for the German people, because like we said, when both the right and the left are screwing you up and screwing you over by just bringing in mass amounts of immigrants and turning Germany from one of the safest countries in the world to one of the least safest countries in the world, especially for women, there's one party trying to stand up against this, and they're being vilified as Nazis. That sounds familiar. It sounds very reminiscent of what we saw the attacks on Trump like. It sounds reminiscent of the attacks we see on Bibi Netanyahu sometimes. So yeah, that's been going on for a while. In the recent elections in the last few weeks, AFD, which historically was a very niche, very small party that kind of barely passed the minimum to be a viable party in Germany, over the last few years has been growing. And over the most recent election, received 21%, which put them second place. And the first place was given to CDU, the Christian Union, the Christian Democratic Union, which is the traditional conservative. So basically they said, hey, here's the people of Germany said, hey, we want the future government to be led by the kind of centrist right with party members of the AFD in a coalition. So that way they pull them right. So the AFD will pull the CDU right. And that way the entire thing will be moved to the right, but the leader will be the CDU, will be Friedrich Merz, who's the leader of the CDU. But instead of listening to the people of Germany, Friedrich Merz said, we will never make a coalition with the AFD. Instead, we're going to make a coalition with all the extreme leftists, including the Greens, who are like radical leftists. So a lot of the people of Germany felt betrayed. And over the past few weeks of negotiations, the polls of AFD's popularity skyrocketed, and AFD went from 21%, what they actually performed in the elections, to over 26%, which made them the largest party in Germany. And that's when they started to become a real threat to the Uniparty in Germany, to the traditional establishment, and they were labeled as a confirmed right-wing extremist party by the BFV, which is the kind of the German courts, I think, and which is like one step before banning them. So they haven't been outlawed yet, but they're basically on the brink, almost being outlawed. And all of the leaders of AFD, aside from being labeled as Nazis, like they have been for many years, they're being harassed and interrogations and investigations and just being nonstop deterred, using very shady legal means to try and scare them away and make the AFD disappear. But that isn't working. And like we're saying, the people of Germany are now, the majority of them are supporting AFD. Not the majority, it's 26%, but it is more than any other party. And it does seem like they're about to be made illegal, which would be ridiculous, because how is Germany a democracy if the opposition gets banned? And again, calling them neo-Nazis doesn't make them neo-Nazis. I listened to what the leader has to say, and I couldn't hear anything that she said that sounded anything Nazi or anti-Semitic to me. But the actions of the uniparty left that has been in control of Germany for a very long time, although not openly anti-Semitic, has done many things that have raised the level of anti-Semitism within Germany to by far its highest level in all of German history since World War II.
When it comes to a lot of political sort of framework that exists in various countries, it's not as open and free as people think. Even recently, Conor McGregor was talking about his interest in running politically in Ireland and how difficult it is for him to even be able to run. And you would think it's a simple thing. Someone wants to run if they can have the financial means and they think they're eloquent enough and good looking enough or whatever else it takes to be able to go and convince people to vote for you, that they should be given a chance. They should be given a shot. And that's not the truth in many countries. Look, even in our country, if you really want to be fair, back in the 2016 elections, although it was a party decision, Bernie Sanders was getting an awful lot of support and getting massive amount of people at his rallies. And he was, in my view, basically pushed aside because the party perhaps wasn't ready for a democratic socialist, although that seems to be who's running the party now. And they basically cleared the way for Hillary Clinton to run as the party leader and representative for the Democrat Party. But Bernie was doing very well. Not that I think he was going to win, but it's interesting when you take a step back and watch the control that's exercised either within parties or within the electoral system as to how it's set up to exclude other parties. Even here in the United States, independents, certainly at the presidential election level, don't have much of a chance of getting in. Ultimately, we had the example with RFK Jr. when he decided that he was going to be pushed aside on these elections by the Democrat Party. He decided to go independent. And bottom line is that's the kiss of death, the likelihood of being able to actually win. He thought he had a path forward, he did the math, and he explained to his supporters how that would happen. But the reality is it's a real uphill climb in the rain and the sleet, the snow, in the dark with one arm and one leg tied behind your back. And if that's that way here in the United States, imagine what it's like in other countries and what behind the scene controls they have to exclude other parties and exclude other candidates. So I don't think it should be as surprising as it is. Doesn't make it right, though.
Yeah, I think during the last Munich Security Conference, when JD Vance went to Germany to talk there, one of the things he said is basically Europe expects the United States to protect them because of shared values. However, when they're fighting against democracy and banning their elections that they don't like we saw in Romania, or banning parties they don't like, I think Marine Le Pen in France was banned as well. It doesn't make Europe seem very democratic. And if they're not very democratic, then what are our shared values with them? And why are they anticipating we defend them because of those shared values? Recently, the Munich Security Conference had another event in Washington, D.C., and they had J.D. Vance speak again, and he gave a fairly interesting talk there as well, and he did a kind of questions and answers. This was the previous one. But yeah, again, if these countries really ditch democracy, then what are our shared values with him? And again, not too long ago, the United States was the one ditching democracy, like we saw by many of the actions and policies of the Biden administration. And some nowadays may say that also the actions of Trump are doing the same. We may not agree necessarily, but many do feel that way. But again, it's really time for Europe to stand up and care for themselves and not just give in to bureaucrats. Because if there's one thing Europe is great at, is amazing at, is world leading at, it's at creating bureaucrats and putting them in positions where they can cause lots of harm and do nothing beneficial, which is usually what bureaucrats tend to do. And there is no greater machine on planet Earth than the European Union and just kind of European governments as a whole.
I have 2 cents to throw into that. I think the sad reality from my perspective is that the European Union has become something that it was never intended to become. It was originally a trading mechanism to allow, which was very logical. You had all these countries. For those living in North America, we're really detached from the rest of the world here by oceans. So unless you go to Mexico or to Canada, you have a long way to get somewhere else. And in Europe, it's not like that. Again, as I've spoken before, my heritage is Portuguese. My parents grew up in a small country right next to Spain, but also right next to all these other countries. So it was not uncommon, even when I visited Portugal many years ago, that you would see license plates on motorcycles and cars that were from Italy and France. And it was a normal thing. Everyone interrelates with each other. And my mom, when she arrived as an immigrant in Canada, she spoke 5 languages. That's much more common in Europe. But the European Union itself has become something completely different. It's a restrictive means of essentially controlling what each of these member countries actually can do. There's 27 countries, and it goes well beyond just trade. For most people, they're not aware, but the European Union itself has its own massive bureaucracy of politicians. And ultimately, there's several presidents, and they're not elected in the way that you would think like we have here in the United States. So there's these various presidents that are, most of the laws that are governing the EU at that level are decided behind closed doors. There aren't like open discussions where people can go and criticize openly. They have the European Parliament and the European Commission. They got presidents for each of these things. And that is part of, I think, what we're seeing, because there's a strong amount of control that comes out of the EU itself that's in one way or another imposed on the member countries. And essentially, the EU is striving for uniformity. I remember years ago, I've told this story before, I was in a grocery store here in Florida, and I just happened to notice something on the shelf, and it was these cookies. And it's called Le Petit Écolier, the little school child. And I remember those cookies, and they were very delicious. They weren't particularly healthy, but they were very delicious, and I used to eat them as a kid. And I'm like, oh, wow, I remember these. They have these up in Canada. They're from France. And as I looked at the box, it says product of the EU. It no longer says product of France. And somewhere in the back, in the finest of print, it mentioned it's made in France. And the goal is to make essentially member countries fall in line and have the same way of thinking. And I believe that there's some amount of political control over really what parties and what people are able, who's able to run for office, because they want to keep those member countries in line with what the goals and ambitions of the broader EU are. Not that long ago, just a few years ago, Great Britain decided that England decided to leave the European Union through Brexit. And that was a big decision. Are they going to stay part of the EU, which they were for a time, or were they going to try to reclaim their independence from the European Union and trade with them, but not be part or a member country? And I think what we're seeing is this idea of really how much control, certainly in some of these countries, really do other forces. And although Australia is not in the European Union, the bottom line is there are broader forces. The World Economic Forum, there's a lot of big power plays that are happening that are indeed political, that control a lot of wealth, and that want countries around the world to essentially move in a specific direction. So don't think that the elections are all entirely free and so forth. I can speak about the elections in Mexico where, what's left of the candidates, and if you just look it up, you'll see what happens to the candidates running in Mexico, certainly at the presidential level. The few that remain are pretty much all candidates who basically are going to agree to do the same things that are expected of them. You don't see too many people that are going to come out of the right or left extreme and show up there and revolutionize the country and what's going on. It's going to be much of the same because there's a lot of control as to who's able to actually be put on the ballot. And at that point, doesn't matter which of the candidates, the three candidates or whatever, actually wins, because the end result will be the same. So I guess that's the reality of politics. And it's interesting to look at. We can't always do much about it, but I think it's important to understand and recognize. The more you talk about it, certainly from our perspective, as we see what's happening here in this country and in other countries, I think it's also good to compare where we're at versus where other countries are at. Sometimes we got it tougher than they do, and sometimes they have it tougher than we do.
Yeah, in terms of the elections in Mexico, I actually spent 2 years more or less living in Mexico, and love the people, love the culture, love the food. The cartels obviously are something nobody loves. I used to think the cartels control the politicians. In reality, many times it turns out the politicians control the cartels. So basically, the politicians, especially if they have a strong army or strong National Guard or other police or military presence, they can basically blackmail the cartel saying, hey, give me 30% of all your rake, all the money you bring in, or else I'm going to send the military and the police to go and attack you and fight you. And oh, this time I'm partnering with a different cartel. So you have all these different elements. So sometimes it's the cartels who influence the politicians. Sometimes it's the politicians who influence the cartels. Sometimes certain politicians are controlled by certain cartels while other politicians are controlled by other cartels. So you can have a situation, for example, where like the Gulf cartel supports the mayor, but the chief of police and the mayor is in control of the National Guard and the Marina. So he has basically two armies with him. And then the chief of police is maybe controlled by another cartel and maybe Jalisco New Generation. So the police are raiding the Gulf cartels, and then the police and then the army and the Marina and the National Guard are raiding the Jalisco New Generation cartels. So it's just a really dirty situation. And like we mentioned, like you referenced earlier, being a politician in Mexico is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. The rate of assassination of politicians is extremely high. And it's like, who assassinated the politicians? It depends which politician, because every politician is bought by certain or controls or has influence on certain cartels. And these things can change as well. They can change their alliances on a quick basis. But before that, you mentioned the World Economic Forum, and I think there have been some notable developments there. Klaus Schwab, I think he stepped down from leading the World Economic Forum, and then there were leaks. There was an insider, a whistleblower, who released documentation from Open Society's Klaus Schwab's personal charity organization, Charity, and they alleged that he used some of the billions of dollars that the charity controls for his own goods, and he used it basically as his own piggy bank, etc., even though he is extremely wealthy on his own. So he was surprisingly and very swiftly forced to quit and basically discarded from Open Society and the World Economic Forum, and I think we both see those as positives.
It's almost like the cartels you're talking about. All of this comes down to massive amounts of money, massive amounts of power. Okay. It doesn't matter if they're politicians or de facto politicians. Ultimately, there's a lot of people in very high positions who want to control where things go and are going to do whatever it takes to make sure that no one interferes with it. Okay, let's just be blunt about it. There was a lot of effort trying to stop Donald Trump from getting back in office. In some ways, it's almost a miracle that he got in, because everything was thrown at him. Okay, massive amounts of lawfare where they threw every kind of lawsuit at him. He had assassination attempts, one of which, by a miracle, wasn't successful. And ultimately, we look at other countries and go, wow, look what they're doing over there. But if you really follow some of the things that have happened over here, by our own standards, they're certainly surprising and concerning. And there's still a lot of talk about what happened with the prior presidents who were assassinated or attempted to be. Conspiracy theories aside, there's still a lot of questions. So, JFK's assassination? They're releasing documents now. Will we ever really know what happened behind the scenes? What really the CIA or FBI knew? I don't know. But there's a lot of sketchy details that call into question what happened. Martin Luther King Jr. Is it a coincidence that he got assassinated? He was calling for peace and unity and trying to advance this country. And what happened to him? Do we not think that there could be some people in very high places that are supposedly either in political office or in positions of power that had something to do with that? No doubt. Is it true? Is it false? Will we ever know? But I just have to say that our hands aren't always clean with regards to what happens politically in this country. And then you start opening the door as to what political influence and tactics have been used by the United States on other governments and other countries. I think, look, ultimately, I think it's great to look at. I think it's great to discuss because we need to. You can't just look the other way, and you question really when people are put in political office, just how they get there or how they're prevented from getting there in this country or anywhere.
Yeah, so just today, the Director of National Intelligence, DNI, Tulsi Gabbard, released another, I think it's 60,000 documents on the assassination of RFK. So that's RFK's Jr.'s father, the brother of JFK, who was also assassinated. And again, I don't know. What she mentioned is that they had to search kind of the archives of the FBI and other federal agencies to try and find these and dig these up because they weren't categorized and part of the previous releases. We did see releases on the JFK assassination, and from my understanding, that didn't reveal much at all. So, yeah, I think the next topic we have up is about a group of people who are looking to buy churches. And that's funny, as earlier we were discussing Europe, and in Europe, we've been seeing the same group buying a whole lot of churches again. Now, unfortunately, I'm personally not religious, I'm agnostic, but unfortunately, I do think religion has a value for the vast majority of people. And unfortunately, the rates of practice of Christianity have been dropping drastically, especially in Europe. When I meet different people, I tend to ask them what religious upbringing they have. And you meet Americans and they'll say Protestant or Catholic or Baptist church or Southern something, right? There are a whole bunch of different churches, but most people grew up, even if nowadays they're not very religious, they did grow up with a religious background. Anytime I meet Europeans, they're like, no, I grew up agnostic, I grew up atheist, I grew up without any religion. That's basically the norm there. And it seems like the more Europeans are losing favor of religion, at least their own religion, and they cease to practice it, unfortunately, it also means that they have less children. I don't know if that's necessarily a correlation or a causation. We do know that religions do convince people to have lots of children. So people becoming less religious and focusing on their careers, etc., may, quote unquote, liberate them from having lots of children. But that is the future of humanity. And when you don't have lots of children, you start importing other people. And in Europe, this started by, hey, there's a lack of truck drivers. Let's just bring in a whole bunch of Moroccan truck drivers and then their families. And then the solution to any problem that constitutes lack of manpower is let's just bring in some people because everybody wants to live in Europe. And what we've seen is this huge transition of the people of Europe and the people and the culture of Europe, where in the past it was very peaceful and very beautiful and very culturally rich. Recently, Europe has become fairly unsafe, especially for women, like we mentioned, and there's huge dominance of this certain group over most other groups. So let's take a look at this clip. This is in the United States, I think.
Sure, here we go.
We are buying these churches. We bought 3 churches so far, converted them to masjids, and now we have one we are buying with a school to make it, because we have to serve the same people. The people who were part of that community, one day they will be Muslims. So we'll make it into a masjid and an Islamic school for our children and their children, inshallah. 100 years ago, they invaded the Muslim world and they built missionary schools and destroyed Islamic schools and masjids. Today, we bring the favor back, turn their churches into masjids and their schools into Islamic schools. Bring the light of Islam to here. We're able to buy ready to go institutions that have been there for a long time, but they emptied out. And now it is time to be filled with Muslims, with reverts, converts. This is an election year. But we're not going to be happy with either candidate. We have to be happy when Islam becomes the best candidate for us. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give Islam the victory in this country.
Yeah, and this is a little appalling because basically, like we said, as people are leaving Christianity, it seems like those churches are being purchased by Muslims and turned into mosques and being used to radicalize the population into, we heard him say, conquer the United States and turn it into an Islamic country. That is the objective, not of every Muslim, but of the Islamic ideology that most Muslims stand behind. And that's the problem, because on a personal level, basically every Muslim person you'll meet will be a wonderful, really nice person. But ideologically, while we think we live in the post-liberal times and who cares about religion anymore, and everybody's becoming more modern and all we care about is the internet and maybe purchasing things on Amazon, many people around the world, even those who immigrate to the United States or Europe, maintain their ideology. And if you think that there is no relationship between you and the Crusaders, they don't think so. They see you as a continuation of the Crusaders. And therefore, they want to come back and they want to murder, rape, and torture you until you convert to Islam. And again, this isn't every Muslim, but this is an ideology supported by the vast majority of Muslims, even if they won't say it directly. And it's very scary because we're already seeing the outcomes of this in Europe, where Europe is being filled with Muslims and many churches are being converted to mosques. And it seems like even that is never really enough because they tend to block the streets to bow and pray in the streets many times. Do we have a clip about that?
We actually do, and it's interesting. If we'll listen in and take note of who actually is presenting this clip to us.
Why do we see Muslims praying in the streets all the time? In the aisles of airplanes, in front of buses, in the most ludicrous places? Why do we see Times Square filled with Muslims praying when there are mosques all around? What is happening? What's interesting to note here is that there's actually a hadith where Prophet Muhammad says that Muslims shouldn't pray on roads, that they shouldn't be praying in public spaces where they could be annoying people and getting in their way. But extremists have chosen to say that these ahadith are not authentic, that they in fact should be praying in places where it's inconvenient for others. And the reason why they want to do this is because they want to show that they can do whatever they want to do. It's a show of force. They want you to see how many of them are out there and how they are willing and able to enforce their will on you in your country. I grew up as a fundamentalist Muslim. I grew up in this Islamist ideology. I was forced into a marriage with an Al-Qaeda terrorist. I intimately understand that mindset. And when they're praying in the streets like that, it's a message to anyone and everyone who can see them. We are here and we are loud and we are proud and we are taking over.
Yeah, that's Yasmin Muhammad. Anybody who is unfamiliar with her work, she is phenomenal. Definitely worth giving a follow. What are your thoughts on the subject, Joe?
I think that first, let's put it in perspective. If we think back, I'll give you a little antidote. My mother years ago decided to look up our family tree. This was before it was even like a thing and people were doing it online. And so she did it the old-fashioned way and was contacting different government agencies in Portugal. And she literally was doing this by hand. And my family tree basically stopped at the time of the Inquisition. And for those that don't know, the Inquisition in Europe basically was a time where you had a choice. You were either Christian or probably not going to live to tell what other religion you are. So there was a lot of movement to basically convert people to Christianity, and oftentimes in brutal ways. And the reality is that it's interesting when we look back on history and how things were done in times past. And like you said earlier, we think now we live in a very different time. A lot of the ideology that's being described, that she was describing, are based on ancient old traditions and ways of looking at the world that are being brought to light today in the modern world. Most people living in comfort in the United States wouldn't think that's even possible, but it's happening. Churches are becoming mosques. Entire cities are becoming predominantly Muslim. And it's not so much an opposition to the religious beliefs. It's just an interesting recognition that there are a lot of Muslim leaders who are openly trying to basically state that they want to overturn and change the United States, and that they're very clearly trying to put people in political office as well. And it's not just the United States, as we mentioned in Europe, that's already happening. If you look at many of the mayors and other political leaders in England, they're all Muslim in many large centers. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's an interesting thing to watch really what's being said as to the reason that some individuals want this to happen. And it's about control, and it's about changing things the way they feel they should be, because they believe that the United States isn't the way it should be.
Yeah, and like we'll discuss later on with the India versus Pakistan, it seems like Indians do have a fairly decent sense on kind of what things are like. In Pakistan, there are like 230 million Muslims. In India, there are like 270 million Muslims. Yes, compared to India's mammoth population of 1.5 billion, that is a minority, but it is still one of the largest Muslim populations in the world. I saw a tweet or something from an Indian who basically described fairly well how Muslims tend to act as their percentage of a population in a certain town or city changes. So again, in a lot of towns and a lot of cities, this is something that the Hindus in India are experiencing firsthand. And something like if they're under 5%, they are model citizens. Model citizens. They don't ask for anything. They don't protest. They don't make any problems. They're model citizens and try to not be problematic. When they're like 5 to 10%, then they start having small demands, little protests, things like that. Once they're like 10 to 20%, then they start becoming really demanding. And even before they're near a majority, once they reach like a large minority, so 20 to 30%, they are demanding Sharia law. They're demanding to turn whatever country, whatever city they're in into Hamastan, into kind of back to the 7th century. And again, Islam itself isn't necessarily very problematic. There were problematic actions by Muhammad and by other people, but as a religion, every religion has lots of problematic people, lots of problematic ideas. What's important is that the modern version of the religion has a way of discarding or pushing people away from following the more extremist texts to the more rational ones. So if the religion can evolve and the modern thought is not radical like some original scriptures may have been, then it's usually fine and can be very beneficial. If you look at the Bible, there are a lot of mentions of eradicating people and stuff like that. Jews and Christians don't act on a daily basis trying to eradicate different groups of quote-unquote non-believers. So during the early expansion of Islam brought a lot of meritocracy to a lot of places around the Middle East. And that's why during its early days, there was this golden age of Islam when they were curious for knowledge. And in this meritocratic state where they treated most minorities fairly well, there was huge progress in medicine and in science. A lot of mathematics were invented by Muslim scientists and stuff like that, and fairly rich and successful. But somewhere around the 7th century or the 10th century, Islam basically froze to time and they went back to the originals. There are a whole bunch of movements within Islam that are focused on returning to the original script. And that's when they basically got stuck in time. So, like you mentioned, we may live in the 21st century. Ideologically, many Muslims live in the 10th century. And there are a lot of kind of normalities from the 10th century that are not accepted nowadays that unfortunately may be common amongst Muslims. One of those things is not being friendly or open to minorities. And people think that the Middle East is the place where Muslims came from. That's Muslim land. In reality, like we mentioned in previous episodes, the Byzantine Empire was a Christian empire, a radically Christian, like a very conservatively Christian empire, and they controlled large swaths of the Middle East. Their capital, they moved from Rome to Constantinople, which is Istanbul, right? So nowadays, what we think as the Muslim country of Turkey, that used to be the Christian empire of the world. And like we mentioned, Iran used to be Zoroastrian with lots of other minorities. Obviously, Israel had lots of Jews, and even Egypt was filled with Coptic Christians. Lebanon had Maronite Christians. So there were a whole bunch of different groups that were dominant in different areas until the 7th century when Islam left Arabia. So Islam is really only indigenous to the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. But as Muhammad was a phenomenal warlord, and so were the later early caliphs, and as they conquered more land, they forcefully converted people into Islam, whether they liked it or not. Actually, one of the reasons why Iran is Shia Islam versus the vast majority of Muslims who are Sunni Islam was the Persian people were treated so bad, so evilly by the Sunni Muslims, and they were forced to convert to Islam, that when they did decide to convert to Islam, they said, you know what, in your face, because you are forcing us to convert torturously. Yes, we don't really have a choice. We must convert to Islam, but we're going to convert to the other branch of Islam. And that's why they converted to the Shia, which were the minority in Islam and still are. Another one of the very, very fascinating groups that we do find in the Middle East is a community called the Druze. Most people have never heard of them. They are small, deliberately small. So a little bit on their religious background. They are technically an offshoot of Islam, but they have separated for a very long time and are no longer considered Muslims. And the Druze they do not believe that anybody can convert to Druze. So in order to be Druze, both of your parents must be Druze. And back when they were having lots of children, that wasn't an issue. But nowadays, it is fairly rare. So unfortunately, they are dying out. They believe, one of the core beliefs of the Druze religion is they believe in Hebrew, it's referenced as Gilgul Neshamot, which means like the rollover of souls. So they believe that every Druze person has a soul from a previously dead Druze person. They see as their ultimate prophet Ithro from the Bible, Moses' father-in-law. So they see him as their kind of ultimate prophet. And it's a very beautiful religion, very awesome people. I think you have a picture of one of the elderlies of the Druze community. And it's just such a distinctive look. You'd imagine straight out of AI, but it's actually not. This is an image from a group of elderly Druze from southern Syria who went to visit holy places for the Druze in Israel because Israel is open to people of all religions. So notably about the geopolitics of the Druze people, they believe, because they're always a minority, they believe in being extremely loyal subjects of whatever country they're in. And they will fight bravely, very bravely, to defend the country that they are part of. So historically, there are very interesting situations where the Druze in Israel, even before the Declaration of Independence of Israel, so even before Israel became a state, the Druze helped the Jews defend their lands because they do believe that it is Jewish land. And they partnered with the Jews at very early times. And through the 1948 and all the wars, the Druze in Israel were very patriotic and very loyal to the state of Israel. And they, in past episodes, we mentioned how the IDF has soldiers who are Muslim, who are Christian, who are Druze, etc. The Druze have basically the highest participation rate in combat roles of any group in Israel, basically. So they are extremely loyal. And thankfully in Israel, they could really be proud of the country because it is the most developed place in the Middle East, aside from oil-rich monarchies maybe, which are not very developed in terms of social rights or minority rights. So the Druze really are, at least in Israel, have been lucky where they really bonded to the Israeli people, and Israelis love Druze, and the Druze love Israelis. That is about the Druze in Israel. But like we said, because the Druze have this idea of being very patriotic to the country you're in, the Druze in Syria, under Bashar al-Assad, who was an Alawite, another minority, they were very loyal to the Alawites. So you had these situations where in some of the wars, the Druze were fighting Druze, but that's how loyal they are. And because they're hardworking and smart and dedicated, they made for some of the greatest generals in Bashar al-Assad's army, specifically because he had to, in dictatorships, you get promoted not based on your competence or capabilities, rather based on your allegiance to the leader, because the leader has to make sure you're not going to stab him in the back or do a military coup or anything like that. It was hard for Bashar al-Assad to trust the majority Sunnis because they can just, since they are the majority, they can overthrow him and replace him. But with the Alawites, he did have more trust. So over the years, the Alawites in Syria were fed the propaganda that every Syrian received about Israel. So they were brought up to hate Israel pretty dramatically, and they did serve in the Syrian military. What happened during the Syrian civil war was the Druze didn't really want to take a side, so they stood it out, I think. But near Damascus, there is a large refugee camp of Palestinians. Again, unlike any other country where refugees get settled, and that's the purpose of the refugee agency, Palestinian refugees, like we mentioned in the past, have a very unique, special standard, and they're treated by UNRWA, and they never lose their refugee status. And not just they don't lose their refugee status, but it's inherited. So their children and their grandchildren are forever refugees. And because Syria, amongst other Arab countries, kept on promising the Palestinian refugees, don't worry, in a few years, we're going to start another war. We're going to conquer Israel. We're going to kill the Jews, and we're going to send you back home. They held back on giving the Palestinians rights. So aside from Jordan, which did give Palestinians equal rights, most other countries did not. So the Palestinian people ended up living in these refugee camps, including next to Damascus. Now, when the civil war broke out, the Palestinians, who are Sunnis, hate the Alawites, who aligned with the Shias, even though they were a separate sect and were considered non-believers by Islam throughout the vast majority of Islamic history. After the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the Iranians needed them as a proxy, so decided to accept them into Islam. So the Palestinians in Syria sided with the coup, and specifically, the vast majority of them sided with ISIS because they do tend to be fairly radicalized Sunni Muslims, and the Sunni Muslims supported Al-Qaeda and then later ISIS. So suddenly, Bashar al-Assad had this issue where right in his capital, he has these huge refugee camps filled with people who now, the vast majority of them, support ISIS. So he dropped on them barrel bombs and chemical weapons and mustard gas and all of the above. But that wasn't enough. So he decided to do a Nakba and kick them out of the refugee camps. The only problem is, where can he send them? So he decided to send them to Mount Hermon, the mountain of the mountain of the Druze. So the Druze have been living there for thousands of years peacefully, and then suddenly there are hundreds of thousands of ISIS supporters and ISIS fighters marching towards them by the decree of their former best friend, who they served in the army for until very recently, Bashar al-Assad, who basically sent them saying, hey, go massacre the Druze and take their land and be on the border with Israel, be a nuisance to Israel. That's what you're good for. If you guys are ISIS, go bother the Israelis, stay away from my capital, was Bashar al-Assad's point of view. But the Druze were suddenly very terrified. And what happened is that some of these ISIS fighters kidnapped a whole bunch of Druze women and maybe men as well. And they wanted huge ransom to release them. And the Druze in Syria didn't have a lot of money. The richest Druze in the world are in Israel. So the Druze in Israel helped fund the Druze in Syria to release these captives. And ever since then, there has been a fairly large or growing cooperation between the Druze in the two countries. And as the Druze in Syria and in Lebanon started to realize that the Druze in Israel are free to practice their religion and free to go to their holy sites, things have really warmed up a lot between the two. Now, just to bring us back to recent times, sorry for the history lesson, but recently Bashar al-Assad fell and the country of Syria is now controlled by al-Julani, which means the one from the Golan, which is now a part of Israel, which is occupied by Israel, or now part of Israel. He was born in Saudi Arabia, but he grew up in Syria, and he became a freedom fighter after joining ISIS and Al-Qaeda. He became a freedom fighter in Syria, fighting against Bashar al-Assad. And he founded a group called Jabhat al-Nusra, which is a subgroup of Al-Qaeda, and they were fairly successful. Eventually, after Hezbollah and the Iranian Quds forces helped Bashar al-Assad kick out the vast majority and defeat the vast majority of the Sunni oppositions, and after the United States bombed ISIS to smithereens, Jabhat al-Nusra was able to move to Idlib, which is a city along the border with Turkey, where they were supported by the Turkish government and were able to maintain control there. And then once Israel decimated Hezbollah, suddenly there was a vacuum of power because the Syrian soldiers were not very loyal to Bashar al-Assad, and basically al-Julani came out of Idlib and conquered the rest of the country very quickly. So he is the current leader there. Recently, I guess we can probably watch the clip of the protests against the Druze in Syria. This is allegedly because an old leader or wise man said something about Muhammad or about Islam. Muhammad isn't a true prophet or something to that respect. And the supposed saying of that caused like crazy lynches and assassinations of the Druze population. So again, we said the vast majority of them are centered in the very south of Syria, along pretty close to the border with Israel. But they do obviously have a community near Damascus, and those are the ones who are being massacred. So Jabhat al-Nusra, or HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the current name of al-Julani's group, they already massacred the Alawites, which were the previous group aligned with Bashar al-Assad. So that kind of made sense. But they were already massacred along the coast. But now, after the responses, there were protests in Syria against the Druze and massacres of Druze people in Damascus. So let's take a look at that clip, and then we can continue discussing this.
Caption to read, want to
Yeah, so for anybody listening, they were yelling that this is Sunni Hama. Hama is a large city in northern Syria, and this is Sunni as in not Druze, and Druze don't have a right to live here. We will exterminate the Druze is another thing they chanted, and then they chanted a whole bunch of Islamic chants. For anybody watching, the logo on the top left was, I think, like a 7 or an 8 petaled star with 7 or 8 different colors, and that is the Druze flag. Just a little reference for anybody listening. An interesting development was after HTS took control of Syria, the Druze in southern Syria basically begged Israel to come to the support because they were afraid of what al-Julani will do to them. And Bibi Netanyahu basically said, we are here to defend the Druze in Syria, even though the Druze in Syria are the same ones who were the generals in Bashar al-Assad's war against Israel. Still, they have a very close kinship to the Druze in Israel and the Israelis, and love the Druze in Israel, and the Druze love the Israelis. Basically, Bibi said, we will protect the Druze in southern Syria. The only issue is there's another province called Daraa right between kind of where Israel is along the Israeli border and then where the main Druze community is, and those are Sunni Muslims. So Israel basically took control of that southern area. They're patrolling it. They removed the weapons from the Sunnis in Daraa. And Bibi very specifically warned al-Julani, do not send your forces south of Damascus. Damascus, the capital of Syria, is fairly south in the country. So he basically said, don't go any further south than that into the Druze territory, because we vowed to defend the Druze of Syria. So when these protests happen against the Druze in Syria, some of HTS's and al-Julani's forces, even though they may not directly be associated with him, they started massacring the Druze in Damascus. And the Druze in Israel started protesting, saying, hey, Netanyahu, you promised to protect our brothers, and our brothers in Syria are being massacred and tortured and raped. Please save them. And then Israel did something called knocking on the roof. Are you familiar with the terminology?
No.
Israel developed a tactic. So in order to avoid killing innocent civilians when Israel attacks a apartment building or facility or anything like that, they do a few kind of things to tell the civilians to leave. Now, this is against any tactics of war where surprise is the utmost of the utmost importance. But what Israel does is say, hey, we're willing to give up on the element of surprise, even though that is extremely important, because we want to avoid killing innocent civilians. And therefore, we will drop leaflets around the building telling the civilians to evacuate because we're going to bomb the building. We will send text messages and have Arabic phone calls to the people in the building telling them to evacuate as soon as possible. And then as a measure of last resort, in order to avoid killing innocent civilians, Israel developed this technology called knocking on the roof. And what that means is we'll drop a small explosive that won't knock down the building. It'll just create a huge boom on top of the building that will scare the residents to running out of the building. And again, many times Hamas would hold the residents at gunpoint, not letting them leave, basically creating the situation of dead civilians, which definitely plays well into the hands of Hamas, especially due to the work of kind of international media. But this tactic of knocking on the roof is a fairly common Israeli tactic. So what Israel did is they knocked on al-Julani's roof. So the presidential palace in Damascus, which used to be Bashar al-Assad's and is now the house of Hamad al-Julani, received a knock on the roof. They were kind and they didn't knock on his actual roof. They knocked on an empty part within the territory, like an empty garden within the palace's territory. But he understood exactly what that warning meant. And then the next night, they bombed a whole bunch of kind of military installations of the Syrian government as well, basically saying, don't fuck with the Druze. So I think it's a very interesting development. There have been the dynamics between the new Syrian leadership and Israel are fascinating in general, and we can discuss that more in depth sometimes at some point. But this specific development with the Druze is very fascinating just because they are this tiny minority that traditionally is this model minority that are really bonded with a bond of blood with the Jewish and Israeli people. And yeah, Israel is basically defending them in their country. The Alawites begged Israel, hey, come defend us as well. But the Alawites are the group of Bashar al-Assad who hates Israel and are very closely tied to Iran because they were accepted into Islam by Shia. So Israel didn't go to war. Plus, they aren't along the border with Israel. They're further up north above Lebanon, so it was less relevant. But here with the Druze, Israel basically sent al-Julani a real message saying, don't bother these people because we will protect them. So it's just a very fascinating development internationally, in my opinion. What do you think?
No, it is. And the context and the background is helpful and makes it make sense.
The next topic on the docket is the Houthi missile landing in Ben Gurion. Do we have a clip for that?
Yes, and it's actually a combined clip. It basically has the bombing at the Ben Gurion Airport in Israel, and then the clip proceeds to show other clips where the retaliation takes place in Yemen. So altogether, it's 3 clips back to back. So basically what we're seeing in the first clip is the Ben Gurion Airport in Israel being attacked. We have the sound muted, but if you heard the sound, there'd basically be a lot of screaming going on. The clip then goes on to a piece from Al Jazeera showing the retaliation in Yemen with the bombing conducted by Israel Defense Forces going and bombing there. If you're just listening to the audio, not seeing the visuals, I'd encourage you to take an opportunity to go to YouTube or Rumble just to look at these videos. They obviously are quite representative of just what was happening at this time. And the final clip is going to show the fully decimated airport in Yemen. Again, tit for tat, Israel had its airport attacked. So the source of the attack had its airport counterattacked, and it's quite significant. Basically, the counterattack was complete, but the airport in shambles.
Yeah, let's just say the Houthis have now shot at least, just in the past week, they've shot like 20 ICBMs. These are intercontinental ballistic missiles. They are large and they're powerful. I have shot at least like 20 of those in the past week at Israel. There were like 4 in the past day. Each one of these are large enough to cause extreme devastation. However, the Israeli Iron Dome, less the Iron Dome, that's more for lower defense, but the David Sling and more predominantly the Arrow 3 missile defense systems were able to intercept and block the vast majority of these ICBMs. Notably, for the very first time in human history, the Arrow 3 was able to demolish one of these in outer space. So it's the first instance of outer space warfare we have in human history, where the Houthis, I think it was the Houthis, it may have been an Iranian ICBM, was shot at Israel, and the Israeli Arrow 3 has the ability to defeat it in outer space even before it reaches Israeli skies. So this, unfortunately, was a miss, and it landed in Ben Gurion, which is Israel's almost only international airport. Technically, Uvda is also an international airport, but that's very down south in area a lot. Basically, Israel's only international airport, and Israel's almost only international Terminal 3. This ICBM landed 75 meters away, so very close. It was just a few dozen meters off from causing huge death and destruction in Israel, and that would have not been good for the people of Yemen or the Houthis. But it's basically fuck around, find out. FAFO. Shoot Israeli airports and you will lose your airport. Now, Israel didn't obviously bomb the airport filled with people. The Mordechai Adrei, who was the IDF spokesperson in Arabic, put out a message notifying all civilians to leave the airport about 2 hours before the Israelis bombed it. And it seems like the vast majority of the civilians did leave. The Houthis have been using that airport to receive cargo flights from Iran and from China with the materials and the weapons that they use to attack Israel. So they didn't just attack a civilian airport for no reason. This is the notable Houthi airport that they use. Israel also bombed the Hudayba port, which is the notable port that the Yemenis use in order to receive arms and ammunition. The United States has been bombing the Houthis now for a number of months fairly extensively, basically ever since Trump came into office. But it seems like this attack maybe was a little bit of a catalyst for the Houthis to sign this agreement that they did with Trump, basically saying, hey, if we can focus our fight on only one enemy, it may be preferable than focusing on the United States as well as Israel. Notably, from Israel's standpoint, the Houthis and Sana'a in Yemen are roughly 2,000 kilometers away from Israel, an equivalent distance to Iran's nuclear facilities. So this is a hint to the Iranian regime saying, hey, if you continue sending your proxies on us, don't forget we can hit you as well. And plus, we can hit you to destroy your nukes. Netanyahu very specifically said, we are very much aware that this is an attack directed and led by Iran, and Iran will pay the results of this attack and a time and date of our choosing. So in addition to these bombings of these Houthi ports and airports that are very important for them to transfer their weapons into their territory, which is not the country of Yemen, it's only the northern part of the country of Yemen, they're also sending a message to Iran, don't think you're too far away for us to get you, we can get to you as well. Obviously, we saw Israel attack Iran in response to the previous ICBM attacks from Iran on Israel, so it isn't new, but it is a reminder saying, hey, we can reach you. Even without American support, we can go that far, stealthily come in and destroy you to smithereens.
And I think it's notable as to how Trump characterizes the reaching out by the Houthis to the United States. I'll let Trump say it himself, but his characterization is pretty stark. It's not like the United States reached out to them and said, cut it out. It's the Houthis reaching out to the United States, essentially putting their arms up in the air and maybe waving somewhat of a white flag. Let's play that clip and then we can comment on it.
We had some very good news last night. The Houthis have announced that they are not, or they've announced to us at least, that they don't want to fight anymore. They just don't want to fight. And we will honor that. And we will stop the bombings. And they have capitulated. But more importantly, we will take their word. They say they will not be blowing up ships anymore. And that's what the purpose of what we were doing. So that's just news. We just found out about that. I think that's very positive. They were knocking out a lot of ships sailing beautifully down the various seas. It wasn't just the canal. It was a lot of other places. And I will accept their word, and we are going to stop the bombing of the Houthis, effective immediately. And Marco, you'll
And that was brought to us courtesy of the Right Side Broadcasting Network. And I think it's interesting as to how Donald Trump describes they capitulated. They're not going to bomb anything, and therefore we won't bomb them. The question remains, even though President Trump mentioned ships specifically, or U.S. flagged ships or ships that are providing international commerce, the reality is, or even military ships, the question is, does that mean that all attacks by the Houthis on Israel are going to stop as well?
So it seems like we did get a fairly clear answer to that. Here in this, Trump very specifically said they'll halt attacks on shipping. Interestingly, the Houthis immediately basically said that they never signed any agreement with the United States and they didn't agree to anything, and they're going to continue their war on ships until the war on Gaza stops, etc. When Marco Rubio was asked about it, he said that this operation was about restoring freedom of shipping, where ships can now cross the Bab el-Mandab Strait and into the Suez Canal. And it seems like this agreement was between the Houthis and the United States to avoid attacking United States commercial and military ships. So it is worth noting that even though under the Biden administration, the Houthis were attacking commercial ships from every country around the world, as terrorists do, ever since Trump came into office and the current campaign against the Houthis, so roughly the past 4 months, haven't attacked international shipping at all. They've only attacked the American military ships located in the straits in the region there, and have continued to ramp up attacks against Israel. So them saying, hey, we'll stop attacking international shipping is meaningless, since they've already stopped doing that for the past 4 months. What they did gain in response was that now stop attacking them so they can focus their attacks and their fight on Israel. And they very clearly said that they will continue their attacks and their bombing of Israel. And the United States has been fairly clear that this is basically an agreement between the Houthis not attacking United States ships. It doesn't even seem certain that they won't attack ships from other countries, but it does seem like that it's pretty likely that they will stop attacking other commercial ships. They did say that they will continue attacking Israeli ships. That said, they have miscategorized Israeli ships a whole bunch of times in the past. It seems like they'll be much more careful and maybe try and focus their attack on Israeli military ships if they come to the area, but they will continue attacking Israel. So this war between Israel and the Houthis has not ended. It won't end until the leaders of the Houthis, Iran, is taken care of. But in the meantime, it does seem that there is a ceasefire between the Americans and the Houthis. What do you think? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Or
I think it's a start. Anytime that people aren't lobbing missiles at each other, it's a good thing. But certainly the United States isn't going to stand idly by and just acquiesce to continued terrorist attacks on Israel. Bottom line is there's going to be pressure, I think, for this to progress. And as the United States continues and proceeds to having some dialogue with Iran, it'll be interesting to see just what comes of all this and what progress we get in the region.
Yeah, so at the moment, the Trump administration is negotiating with the Iranians on a new JCPOA, a new kind of nuclear agreement that is becoming very reminiscent of the previous agreement that Trump walked away from, which is surprising. But Steve Witkoff seems to believe that basically restoring that previous agreement, aside from the 15-year clause, dead end or expiration clause, but the vast majority of other things, it seems like the United States is now fine with, including enriching uranium to the low levels to use for civilian reactors like 3.67. But then the State Department clarified that he likely didn't mean that they can enrich the uranium. Rather, they can purchase enriched uranium from the Russians or the Chinese, but they can continue to maintain their civilian nuclear reactors. But it is very reminiscent of the previous agreement. It does mean they can keep the know-how on the nuclear matter in-house, and then when pressure leaves down or there's a new administration, maybe they can ramp things up back again. So it's still to be determined what the outcomes of these negotiations are. But what we know from experience with negotiating with terrorists for a very long time, whether it's negotiations between Israel and Gaza and Hamas, or even the peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, or negotiations with Iran, they usually demand for concessions in order for them to come to the negotiating table. It's not, hey, we want to stop this fighting, let's negotiate. It's no, what can you give us in order for us to be willing to negotiate with you? And usually Western countries acquiesce and say, okay, we'll give you this, we'll give you that. Let's just come to the negotiating table. Let's talk already. And then they already have a win for their public and they can take that back to the bank if they need to, or they can sign an agreement or drag you along for a whole bunch more to get more concessions to leave the table, to get more concessions to come back to the table, and then to take a small step and maybe a memorandum of understanding. Let's get some concessions for that. We'll get concessions all the way, and then we'll never sign on the final agreement, or if we do, it'll be a Hodaiba agreement we can back out of, like we discussed in the past as well. It is par for the course. It does seem like maybe what Trump is doing in this case is giving them a concession for the Iranians, giving the Iranians a concession in the format of stopping the attacks on the Houthis in order for them to come to the table or to continue the negotiations or to warm up towards a future agreement with Iran, or maybe to appease them so maybe we can get something better in the nuclear negotiations. So that does seem like the feeling that what this may be associated with. Plus, Trump is against, it seems, all fights and all wars at the moment, even those that are desperately needed. So although it does seem like the Houthis will continue to attack Israel and Israel will continue to retaliate, it does allow the Houthis to focus on one enemy as opposed to two. And again, Israel has to fly 2,000 kilometers in order to reach Yemen, which is very taxing on the fighter jets, especially on the refueling planes. It is a lot easier for the United States to take off from Diego Garcia, which is fairly close, even though that's the middle of nowhere, or specifically where we've been seeing these attacks on the Houthis occur from the American standpoint, which is the USS Truman and other aircraft carriers. And those can be stationed right there and just continue bombing the Houthis on a regular basis. So it does seem like it's a benefit for the Houthis. Yeah, but like you said, we'll wait and see.
We'll wait and see. Meanwhile, they're not the only ones that are stirring things up and in the midst of really big question marks as to where we'll be. Let's focus a little on India and Pakistan. India was attacked recently. We talked about that in the last episode, or the one before that. And that was a horrible attack, as we mentioned, reminiscent of October 7th. It just was senseless. It wasn't a military attack. It was truly terroristic. And as we expected, India wasn't going to sit idly by and do nothing.
Yeah, and in that horrific terror attack, actually, the terrorists went by every person and they asked them if they were Muslim before they assassinated them.
Yeah, I heard the same reporting. In fact, the specifics I heard is that they went up to the males, to the men, and they asked them to recite verses from the Quran. And if they were unable to, they knew that they obviously certainly weren't religious Muslims, and therefore they were a good target, and they did what they did to them. There's the element, the religious element to it. There's Pakistan basically saying that they didn't coordinate, control, or have anything directly to do with these lone actors, so to speak. But again, there's, just like we see throughout the world, countries want to do something, they use proxies and intermediaries to go and do their dirty work. And then they said, that's not us. It wasn't our military that did it. But we were pretty certain that India wouldn't view it that way, which clearly what they did in retaliation was a targeted attack, not at Pakistani military or the people or whatever. What did they do? Who did they target?
Yeah, these Jaish Muhammad or Jaish al-Islam or whatever the name of the terror organization is that conducted this terror organization, this terror attack. And the Indians actually took a few days to make sure that they have the targets ready and prepared. Notably, they attacked, I think, 9 targets with large bombings. They used a whole bunch of fighter jets, including the Rafale. Rafale is a French fighter jet made by Dassault. It's notable because they lost a Rafale. This is the first Rafale lost in combat in history. So the French were very proud that their fighter jet was never lost in combat. It was downed now. The Pakistanis claim they downed 5 Indian military jets. The Indians claim that isn't true, and the only jet that fell was, I think, this Rafale that had an accident in India. It is a very mountainous region. It's hard to fly there. So there was one crash in India. It is still not clear if it was downed by the Pakistanis or not, but that's the one downed plane that both sides agree on. The Pakistanis also claim that they downed another 4 planes, but we haven't seen any evidence for that yet. But we have seen a whole bunch of evidence of the bombings. Do we have a clip of that?
We do have one very short clip of the actual retaliation by India in Pakistan. Here, let me.
It is worth noting that India, I think, attacked 9 different bases. 5 of them are within Kashmir, so the Pakistani part of Kashmir, but 4 of them are in Pakistan proper. This isn't the first time India is attacking in Pakistan proper in retaliation to terrorist attack. I think they did a similar thing about a year ago. But this is also the furthest they've went within Pakistani airspace to attack one of these terror camps. And again, the Pakistan can claim that they've got nothing associated and they're unaware and they're clueless, blah, blah, blah. But it's been documented for decades now that the ISI has been funding many terrorist groups and organizations, including these. And it's impossible that these terror groups have all of their training camps in Pakistan and the ISI is completely unaware of it. When the United States discovered that Bin Laden was living in Islamabad, which is one of the largest cities in Pakistan, in a compound about like 500 meters or something from the Pakistani military training officer cadet school or something. Really? You didn't know? You really didn't know? So about Bin Laden, I'm not certain if they didn't know or they didn't know, but about these terror camps, they are definitely aware and they're helping fund and hide and conceal it. This does seem like it may escalate if Pakistan does decide to retaliate. In the past, there were similar attacks and Pakistan didn't really retaliate strongly. Here, Pakistan can save face, claiming that they downed these 5 quote-unquote fighter jets. That can help them save face. Like we mentioned, Pakistan is a failing state, is really just a mess. The economy is collapsing. The government can't hold onto power and is being overthrown on a regular basis. So it's very much a not stable country. Unfortunately, that is a very good motivation for countries to start a war, because usually when there's an external enemy, it helps people unite. And many countries have done this repeatedly to help gather support for the local politicians, because usually the local leader gains huge growth in followership, popularity. It is possible that Pakistan will retaliate and this thing can escalate. Hopefully that isn't what we will see. But it is worth noting that there are like 230 million Muslims in Pakistan, but there are 270 million Muslims in India, which, although, like we said, India is 1.5 billion people, it's still a minority. It's still a very large minority. And the last thing India wants is the Pakistanis to stir up the local Muslims to go on jihad and start murdering their local neighbors, because that could become a very bloody civil war within India. So, yeah, this thing has ways of escalating in a variety of ways. And I guess we'll have to wait and see and hope for the best.
Yep, and it's important to keep an eye on it. As we always say, what happens halfway around the world does come to affect all of us in some way, in some form. And ultimately, we should care about what happens to people, even if they're in other countries. It's again, power, money, politics, all this stuff really just, the people that are stuck in the middle are just the people trying to live their lives. It's always sad, really always.
Yep.
But I think on that note, we should transition to something we can at least inject a little bit of humor into. Not that our next topic isn't serious, but at least we can rightfully add a little bit of comedy relief to the next topic, which is one of my favorites. As everybody knows, I love talking about health and wellness and medicine. And for those that haven't been following, I have an undergrad in exercise science, so exercise physiology and nutrition and so forth. I was a paramedic for a number of years. I worked as a clinical perfusionist, running a heart-lung machine and working in trauma and heart surgery for a number of years. I ran an ambulance academy for a while, at least a part of it. And for me, I've been around people that have been very sick, and I've been able to see just what it's like, and I've been able to visit Oz and look behind the curtain and see just what it's like. So it's very painful to see what's happening at times within the healthcare system. When I was a clinician, day to day, there was nothing more important than our patients. And today it comes into question really why certain things are being done and why we're in the predicament that we are. So a topic that I like talking about generally has to do with just the simplest of things, and that is the state of our health here in the United States. We've become a very sick, very obese population, and it didn't happen overnight, but it's getting worse. The rates of cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, autism, you could just go on and on. In fact, a lot of young people now are experiencing very advanced cancers at an early age that we never saw before. And we don't really know for sure what's causing all of this, but we certainly want to look at the things we can control to prevent it from getting worse. And one of the topics that always comes to bear is really our nutrition. And most of the food we have available to us is not very healthy. It's actually quite a chore to go and eat. The first difficult thing is to even understand what that means. Many of the things that we've been taught, and that I was taught formally in school about proper nutrition, are inaccurate. They're either lies, misrepresentation, half-truths, or just completely misguided. The nutritional guidelines that are followed by nutritionists and dietitians are guided by government-run agencies that have industry players that are helping shape what those good and bad foods are. The chemicals, the additives, the massive amounts of sugars that come in many different forms and many different names in virtually every food item has resulted in, I can tell you, in my inner circle of family and friends, I have more than a handful that have autoimmune conditions. They have the offshoots of that, which include things like Hashimoto's, which results in hypothyroidism, Graves' disease, hyperthyroidism, but they're all caused by the same underlying problem, which is an autoimmune condition. Why are so many people having their own bodies seemingly attack their own organs? And we have to ask these questions and we have to look for answers. If someone's young and relatively healthy, the hope is that they'll stay that way. The sad truth is the younger our population, the more likelihood they'll have problems down the road because the food they've been eating from an early age probably isn't as healthy as it was when I was younger. My European parents were making everything from scratch. It just isn't like that anymore. Most things come from a box, a can, some kind of package with a barcode on it. And perhaps to just really solidify this sort of predicament that we're in is a clip that we came across that we kept watching and thought was amusing, but it makes the point. It has a chef who is in front of a group of children, young children, and ask them to identify various fresh food items. And it's quite comical, but the more we watched it, the more we really recognize that this is probably not far from the reality of just how detached we've become from natural food. Certainly our children now are accustomed to things coming out of boxes and so forth and cans and not recognizing actual food items. So let's play that clip and we can chat a little more about it. I think for those certainly who are watching, and if you're not on YouTube, Rumble, or any visual streaming of this, you need to go on and look just to believe that these poor kids really can't recognize the items they're being asked to recognize. Here we go.
Who knows what this is?
Potatoes.
Potato? So you think these are potatoes? Not potatoes, though.
I don't know.
Do you know what this is? No? Who knows what tomato ketchup is? Yeah, that's what it's made out of.
Oh, tomato ketchup? I know that.
The test I did with the kids today was shocking. Do you know what that is? Do you know what that is?
Broccoli.
What about this? A good old friend. Do you know what this is, honey?
Celery.
No. What do you think it is, darling?
Onion.
Onion, no. Immediately you get a really clear sense of, do the kids know anything about where food comes from? Who knows what that is?
A pear.
A pear, no.
A turnip.
No. Okay, I'm going to give you the first word. Egg.
Egg. Egg salad.
The answer today was no.
Yes, just for reference.
Plant, cauliflower, they had no idea. And I don't think it's a one-off. I think a lot of kids just, they knew what tomato ketchup is, but they didn't know what that came from.
At least they're familiar with the word tomato by being familiar with the term ketchup. If people are unfamiliar, there's a concept in the United States called food deserts. And those are places where I think it's like over 50 miles or something like that, where people who live there do not have access to fresh grown fruits and vegetables. They usually live next to a Dollar General or some store like that has a whole bunch of packaged items. So they could get things that are categorized as food, but are extremely processed and none of which are even remotely healthy. But they do not have access to kind of fresh fruits and vegetables or fresh meat or fish, etc. And millions, maybe tens of millions of Americans live in these food deserts. Just in America, people can live wherever they want. So if you don't live in a big city, you don't live near big supermarkets, there won't necessarily be, especially if it's in a poor area, there won't be nice supermarkets with a nice produce aisle. Then you may end up living in a food desert, because if everybody around you doesn't have much food and the only thing available is like a Dollar General store or something like that, a Dollar Tree, the food you end up purchasing is prepackaged, highly processed, fake food, not real food.
So it's no doubt that given that most people, in fact, up to, I believe in the United States, it's something close to 70% of the diet is processed or ultra processed food. It's not natural. You can't find the things people are eating coming out of the ground. Okay. You won't see them being pasture eating the grass. These are things that are made by humans and put in a package of some kind, and that's what people are eating. And it's one thing for the kids not to know what's healthy for them or natural or what a tomato looks like, but the sad reality is most adults have struggled to know what proper food is. And why is that? Because the experts are often giving information that is either confusing, do eat this, don't eat that, the next year it changes, or it's just not very clear. And there's a lot of pressure from the food manufacturers to certainly avoid any attempt to point out that highly processed foods probably aren't the best choice of foods, and that getting a simple piece of fruit or vegetable that comes out of the ground is certainly a better step. Eating meat is actually healthy. And these are conversations that, again, who do you have them with? Most physicians have literally 0 hours of nutrition training. They're not qualified to discuss nutrition with their patients. They certainly shouldn't be the leader in helping set up the patient for success with regards to their nutrition. And little surprised that our population has become sick, obese. A large percentage of US citizens and people living even abroad are either struggling with type 2 diabetes or are insulin resistant on their way to being pre-diabetic and then type 2 diabetic as well. It is so pervasive, so prevalent. And it's even, as we mentioned in other episodes, it's now in kids. There was no such a thing as a kid with type 2 diabetes not that many years ago. It used to be called adult onset diabetes. We can't call it that anymore because there's so many kids that are sick from consuming too much sugar, too much fruit-based sugar or fructose, from drinking too many fruit juices, from drinking too many sodas with high fructose corn syrup. And it's just become a real problem. And today, the solution always seems to be a pill, a shot, some quick fix, rather than giving the correct answer that, look, it might have taken you X amount of years to get to this point. Now it may take you a few years to get back to full health, but these are the things you need to be trying to do. And one of the things that I find very alarming is this huge push to make GLP1 agonists a class of drug that was originally used to control and to help diabetics, now is being used in much higher doses to have weight loss happen very rapidly in not only obese patients, but patients who just want to look better in a bathing suit. Okay. And it's gotten so common. It's an expensive proposition, not only because the brand drugs are very expensive, they're over $1,000 a month. There are cheaper alternatives, which compound pharmacies will go and mix these drugs for you at much lower cost. So aside from the cost aspect of it, people aren't realizing really what they're signing up for. That's really the concern. GLP1s, these are glucagon-like peptide 1 drugs. It was discovered that there was this glucagon-like peptide that could be packaged and used. And glucagon, what it does is it's used in emergency medicine. If you have someone that's got a really low blood sugar, glucagon can be administered, which will cause the liver to release the stored form of sugar that it has, which is called glycogen. So it's a way to release sugar and raise the person's blood sugar, but they realize it has other effects. And as patients who are diabetic were being treated with these medications. The names are now very common. You hear them all the time, but Ozempic is one of the more common ones, which is semaglutide. But there's others that are used now for weight loss. There's Mounjaro, Wegovy, Zepbound. They're like everywhere, and commercials for them all the time. What they discovered when they were giving these diabetic patients this class of medication was that they were actually losing weight. It wasn't only helping their diabetes, but it was actually causing them to lose weight. And of course, someone had the bright idea, if they're losing weight, what if we gave a much higher dose for the sole purpose of losing weight, or the primary purpose of weight loss? And guess what? It works. You lose a lot of weight. You can easily lose 16, 17% of your body mass, your weight, in a short period of time. And people are, Hollywood, all the actors and actresses have been on this for the last couple of years. There's been this huge explosion of patients that are taking this, which, whether it's really indicated for them is of questionable means. It doesn't mean that GLP-1 agonists don't have a purpose. And for the right patient, with the right medical supervision by properly qualified and trained prescribers, doctors, and so forth, these drugs have a purpose. But they're being used like candy. And ultimately, what we're discovering is that these drugs, much like other predecessor drugs that were able to substantially reduce one's weight, they tend to have some really shocking potential risks. One is the psychological risk. We have found that patients that are on GLP-1s very often, within a short period of time, start having psychological issues, depression. Another very interesting finding is they develop this flat affect, where things that used to make them happy and excited in the past, let's say they collected stamps or played pickleball, they may not have an interest in those things anymore. They turn boring, basically. And it's believed that the reason that happens is GLP-1 have receptors in the brain, and it seems that just like the food addiction that the individuals are essentially treating with the drug, it's also getting rid of other type of reward systems, where if there was other pleasurable things, they may no longer find pleasure in them. It's a concern, because if you're on this for a period of time and you come off these drugs and now you're struggling with depression, or your joy for life, your joie de vivre has disappeared, what kind of life are you looking at, even though you can fit into a bathing suit better? So these are serious concerns. And then there's other medical concerns. There's the fact that the drugs basically delay the emptying of your digestive system. So since the food doesn't clear as fast, you feel full. In fact, many patients, when they start taking these drugs, are nauseous. They may even throw up. They really feel horrible. It's like they've really gorged themselves on a meal, even without eating that much. So food turns you off. And specifically, a lot of the carbohydrate-laden foods don't attract you anymore. So that's a positive thing. But you're relying on this drug to do that. All along, you have this delayed emptying. They've just now alerted that this drug, if anyone is on it and they're going to go for either deep sedation or they're going to undergo general anesthesia, patients are being told to discontinue taking this drug for a period of time before, because you don't want to have a full digestive system when you're under general anesthesia, because the contents could come up and you can aspirate and go into your lungs. There's cases now where patients are having gastroparesis, the gut paresis paralysis. So they're actually getting a paralyzed gut where they're having to have a colostomy tube put in, where they're now pooping into a bag. These things are actually happening. Another odd yet interesting thing with these drugs is that most patients, most individuals, by the time you pass puberty and you get into adulthood, the number of fat cells that your body has is pretty much stable. But the fat cells may grow, get full and empty if you change your eating habits, but you don't get typically a whole bunch more fat cells. GLP-1s will typically result in an increase in the number of fat cells. While you're on the drug, those fat cells do tend to stay empty. But if you ever come off the drugs, there's a problem, because now you've set yourself up to be able to accept much more fat in your body than you could have actually had before. And the reality is most patients, the thought is we have to stay on these drugs forever. Most patients, a large percentage, I've looked at a couple of studies, it shows that as many as 70 to 80% of these patients come off these drugs within 1 to 2 years, either because the positive effects of appetite suppression or control and all the other things taper off, or they don't feel well, or there's something making such the majority of patients not be able to continue these drugs beyond the first 1 to 2 years. And because of that, if no other interventions, no other lifestyle changes have come about, the patients are going to be setting themselves up for a major problem. And probably the thing that concerns me the most is that when you lose all this weight with this class of drug, what happens is you're not just losing fat, you're losing lean muscle, you're losing non-fat tissue, connective tissue. And it could be as much as 20, 30% of your weight loss could be coming from something other than fat. And that's a real problem, because aside from the damage it causes, which results in things like people talk about Ozempic face, Ozempic butt, when you start losing the actual muscle in your body, you look like you've been starved, because the essence of what happens on these drugs, part of the reason you're losing weight too is because you really are massively reducing your caloric intake. And you're basically taking someone who previously was perhaps consuming more calories than they needed, certainly consuming most likely very bad mix of calories, mostly coming from carbohydrates, and now they're starving themselves. So you have a person who is obese who's now starving themselves into weight loss. Not a healthy situation to be in. And at the tail end of this, especially in older patients, especially if they're 60-something years old or older, I can tell you from my exercise science and physiology background, aging is directly tied to muscle loss, sarcopenia. When you start losing muscle mass, that's a bad thing. And as you're older, you can't regain that muscle easily. It's gone. Good luck trying to regain that. And it used to be said, people believed, even when I was doing my undergrad, there was talk, people, as you get older, you lose some muscle. It's really believed now that because people tend to maybe abandon exercising, resistance exercises that maintain muscle as you get older and become more of a couch potato, it's the muscle loss itself that triggers a lot of the things we attribute to aging. In other words, if you have a situation where you're taking a drug that's going to make you lose muscle, you're really not doing yourself a favor as far as having a long, healthy life. You may look better, but you may be winding up sicker. And it's, again, not that these drugs don't have a purpose. It's just that I have found that historically, whenever people are looking for an easy, quick fix and a silver bullet that's going to magically fix everything without looking at the root causes, they've actually looked at this. No one has got a shortage of GLP1. It's not like you're replacing something. If you're a type 1 diabetic, you do have inadequate or no insulin. It's totally different. But in this situation, you're giving a drug that has an effect, that has a lot of side effects. And unless very carefully controlled with a team approach with a physician and maybe a nutritionist that really understands what changes need to be made, and the person is using these drugs as a means to get to where they need to be, I think a lot of people will be very disappointed as to where they wind up. And even worse, maybe struggling with some of the consequences of taking it. And there's a clip I'm going to play right now as I keep speaking that I found just to show the point. This is a clip from years past that's been resurrected. There's no sound in this, so I'm just going to keep playing it. Basically, it's a clip from the She the People channel. You may want to follow them. They're all about women and empowerment, called the Women's Channel. And they pulled up this old clip and basically talks about how in the 1900s, women were willing to risk everything to look thinner. They secretly consumed pills that contained tapeworm eggs. Now, if you don't know what a tapeworm is, you can get these, and these worms grow in your body, and they basically starve you of the nutrients. They live in your digestive system. I had someone that I knew years ago that was always thin, looked pretty good, and one day went to the emergency room. When he was there, his blood pressure dropped so low they thought he was going to die. When his blood pressure dropped so low that even the medical team was ready to resuscitate him, the tapeworm he had in his body that was several feet long, that he didn't know was in there, I guess must have believed that the host where it was living in was dying, and this several foot long tapeworm came out of his rectum. The patient, my friend, woke up to the screams of the medical staff and nursing staff as this snake-like creature was coming out of his rear end in the emergency room. Okay. And so tapeworms are a real thing and people can have them. But obviously, in times gone by, people knew that tapeworms could cause a situation where you just couldn't seemingly gain weight, because as you would eat, the tapeworm would consume a lot of the nutrients. So to think that people in this day and age are going and trying to take GLP1 agonists to somehow magically lose weight, I guess it's not as bad as ingesting tapeworm eggs and hoping that they will keep you from getting fat. But we've always, as humans, tried to find an easy way out. And I think that the answer is perhaps we haven't found one yet. And the broader discussion, which this just is a piece of the ongoing conversations we're having about nutrition, empowerment, and basically, we're not giving medical or health advice. We're saying empower yourself to ask the right questions, to ask your prescribers about these drugs if you're considering taking them or on them, about what the true consequences are and what other things you really probably should be doing in conjunction with taking these medications, because you have to know at some point either you got to come off of them, or if you don't, what happens, and if you do, what happens. And
exactly,
like I said earlier, the big problem is much of the information out there is either a partial truth or a misguided truth, and it's very hard for most people to really know, what to believe. So I'll end off with another, perhaps most amusing clip. This one does have audio. It's one of the ones both you and I like, but it's accurate. This one comes from South Park, and it is amazing how you've brought up in the past that comedy is one of the best ways sometimes of giving information, because you can sometimes say things that you couldn't otherwise say, right?
Yeah, 100%.
And it's quite interesting how South Park and I think The Simpsons often have made world commentary, political commentary, in this case, medical commentary, which is really on the money, and it may be intended as a joke, but I think that comedies, in this case, is well represented in reality or vice versa. And one of the concerns I've had, and it's been well identified, is that the current food guidelines, the food pyramid and everything we've used, even since the food pyramid has come to be used, and it's used in schools and hospitals. Some of the worst food, in my opinion, is what they feed you in a hospital or a school or in penitentiaries where people are incarcerated and don't have a means of getting outside food, are really based on guidelines which are flawed or incorrect. So The Simpsons put it better than I can. And so do South Park, and so do all these other people when it comes to these type of things. This is the South Park clip, and it's going to speak for itself. Here goes.
It's dinner time on the East Coast in less than an hour. People are going to die.
Sir, we've got a boy on the hotline who says he might know something.
Who is this?
My name isn't important. What matters is that the answer is in the pyramid.
The pyramid? That's ancient stuff you're talking about. Are you sure? Bring up the pyramid.
What is it? What is it for?
We built the pyramid a long time ago to illustrate how much people should eat of the 4 basic food groups.
Sir, we abandoned the pyramid when Michelle Obama got involved.
The pyramid doesn't work. We've already tried it.
It's upside down.
What?
Sir, the pyramid is upside down.
Turn the pyramid upside down.
You can't be serious. That would put butter and fat at the top
Flip the damn food pyramid!
This is not FDA approved!
It's dinner time on the East Coast in 10 minutes. Now do it!
Sir, we've got a match.
Nutrition is stabilizing.
We've got a well-balanced vaccine, sir. Get the president on the phone. Tell him to have some steak with his butter.
Yeah, and steak with butter is
Tell him to have some steak with his butter.
yeah, and steak with butter is one of the more healthy foods you can consume. So even though in the 70s all dietitians would tell you that that would kill you, in reality now we know that there's healthy fat and unhealthy fat, and usually naturally occurring fats like fats from animals or a specific not highly processed fats like avocado oil or olive oil or coconut oil are very healthy for you, while unhealthy fats will kill you. I never grew up in a food desert, but I never grew up loving fruits and vegetables. The one place I learned to love fruits and vegetables when we lived for a few months in Albania, and there people will give you tomatoes that grow in their garden, and you take one bite and is holy moly, this is nothing like the tomato I bought in the supermarket in the United States. It's just so full of flavor and so alive. In terms of GLPs, I do have a kind of personal anecdote. My father-in-law has been taking it for a while. He's had lots of health issues tied to diabetes, kind of heart issues and stuff like that for many years. And he's struggling for a long time. And a few years ago, he started taking Wegovy or one of these GLP1s. And at the beginning, we were just astonished because from the person who loved the most unhealthy foods more than anybody else and would always take additional portion and eat more than everybody else, suddenly he was like full within 2 bites. He wasn't motivated, didn't want foods, even the unhealthy junk food that he used to go crazy and crave for. So we were surprised and astonished. It really was like magic. It was just completely unbelievable. Whereas, like you said, sometimes he would feel nauseous and not really be into meals, or he would take a few bites and get really full and just not want to eat more. But it was just substantial and it was like magic. It was just completely unbelievable. That said, now that he's been on the drug for the past 2 or 3 years, we just hung out with him again. And even though he's still on the drug, it seems to have lost basically all effect. And nowadays, he always wants to eat more and he wants another serving and he wants some more of the unhealthy food. He wants the extra sweet. So even though it was extremely effective at the beginning, it seems to have basically stopped working. Even though he's still consuming the drug, it seems to have stopped working after a few years. So that is something that's definitely worth realizing. This drug is a very new drug, fairly, on the market. And there haven't been many long-term research on the subject and on the long-term outcomes. So this is just a personal anecdote, but we were surprised that even though he's still taking the drugs, it's like all the magic effects have suddenly disappeared. Not suddenly, over a few years, but they have essentially completely disappeared. And like you said, the side effects don't disappear. And trying to get off of such a drug is even worse because then your body grows fat even faster. So it's one of those drugs that you need to take for life, even though you really shouldn't be doing so. But if it stops losing effect after a few years, then you really should stop taking it. But most people won't, and most doctors will not stop prescribing it, even though it may not be affecting you properly anymore.
So the experience, that's a typical experience. And some patients will just keep taking it because they don't know any better, let's say. And this has been seen with other drugs before. It's like a pendulum, right? Something becomes it goes viral, basically. That's what's going on here. Where there's you can't even get some of these drugs because they just aren't available. Everybody wants them. They're in massive demand. Companies are popping up everywhere that are compounding pharmacies that mix a comparable off-label version of it. And the challenge is that there is experience with this class of drug in the treatment of diabetes. The problem is for weight loss, the doses being given are just so astronomically greater, number one. And the problem is the drugs are being given as a standalone. That this is like essentially, here you go, take it. And the patients might not even want to go back to the doctor for anything else, or because they're saying, look, this is working wonderfully. Look how much weight I've lost. And they will lose weight. That's the problem in a way, because it looks like it's doing such a great job. In the right patient, with the right clinician that is carefully monitoring what's being done, there's a value and a purpose for these drugs, just like there has been in diabetes. The problem is that's not how they're being used. They're being used in massive quantities to lose as much weight as possible. And we don't know the long-term effect of these drugs at high dose. We don't know. We do know that more and more warnings are being included in the product insert for these drugs. We do know that a percentage of patients are at greater risk for pancreatic cancer. And we do know that the depression thing and the other psychological issues are real and they're presenting. How bad is it going to get? We don't know. We also know that the weight loss, again, is not only fat. And the older the patient, the bigger that becomes a problem because they may not have an opportunity to ever properly regain. And it's not just muscle, but we believe connective tissue and other things that your body needs. So it basically makes the patient more frail. Not a good thing. And if you really look at how these patients tend to look, I can look at people and say they're probably on a GLP-1 agonist because they get a certain look about themselves. And it's a look of starvation because mechanistically, that's what the body believes is happening. The body believes it's being essentially starved. And in part, there is a significant calorie restriction, but it's more complicated than that. And if you really asked a doctor exactly all that's going on with these drugs being given, they don't know. With a lot of drugs, we don't completely know how they work in its entirety. We know some of the effects. We know some can be beneficial. And an interesting side note with this, just like I mentioned that a lot of the patients wind up either depressed or having worsening of underlying psychiatric illness or have a blunted kind of affect where they have no excitement in anything anymore. There is a potential other use for these drugs that they have found that individuals who are hardcore drug addicts, these drugs, surprisingly, can get a lot of, it's not someone that's a casual user of marijuana or whatever. We're talking someone that's really heavily addicted, start losing interest in those drugs and in that addiction because essentially it works the same way as any other like addiction such as food. So these drugs may have a really good benefit or purpose, but I don't think we found it yet. And I think it's being overprescribed. And it's just one of these things that I think people need to learn about. Everything you're going to take, if you're going to be prescribed something,
Yeah, just a note for my father-in-law. On the most recent, he used to go out with us wherever we'd go, and he'd like to come on walks and on trips and hang out with us. And most recent trip, he did have some other issues with his feet that are also related to diabetes, but he was just so almost against going out. He ended up staying in the house the entire time, and he would hardly come out with us, and he would hardly explore. We were in a beautiful city filled with culture and so much to see. And yes, he was in a lot of pain walking, but he just lost all excitement that he used to have going out and exploring the world and discovering new cultures and peoples and languages and flavors and stuff like that. Yeah, I think in terms of the next topic, we do have something that's related. This discussion, we were talking a lot about the kind of the medical world and the influence medicine has and the medical companies have on people's health. I think similar is our next topic, which discusses government and media corruption. Obviously, they're not completely separate, but they're also not completely related. They're somewhere in between. Do we have that clip?
Sure. And as we've talked, I pull it up, as we've talked on other episodes, the drug ads that we have here in the United States are not always, it's not maybe that they're lying, but they certainly are maybe not forthcoming with all the details. This next clip gives an example of how the media in politics doesn't always share the whole truth. They may give a small snippet of it that isn't necessarily a lie, but their characterization of it is perhaps a lie. And this is Jeffrey Mead from his channel. He does, what a great job. Let's listen in.
This here is a perfect example of what the media does to get people to hate Trump. The Vatican asked Pope Francis' funeral attendees to wear all black. Trump wore a blue suit. So that's what the media says, and this is the image they show you, right? Now here's a picture with more context, and you can see how many other people were dressed. I'm zooming in a little bit more so you can see it. There's a lot more blue than what the media was trying to lead people to believe. Again, this is the image they showed us. And this was the reality. And this is a perfect example of why the trust in the traditional media is at an all-time low. Like they had to zoom in and get the perfect situation to push their narrative. And again, it's not about being intellectually honest or even fair. It's about pushing a narrative. And this is a perfect example of that. And it's beautiful to see the American people picking up on that, and not trusting these traditional media outlets. Clearly, he was not the only person wearing blue there, but the media wants you to believe something else.
Yeah, and this is really spot on. Like we've seen with the drug companies, we, like you mentioned, we actually analyzed in depth some of their advertisements in previous episodes of the podcast, and definitely worth taking a look at those. The reason the drug companies advertise in the United States on TV is not necessarily to convince you to buy a drug or even to convince your doctor to buy a drug. It's to buy favor with the media. So that way the media will obfuscate the truth about the damages caused by their drugs, about the lawsuits against them, etc., and will not cover it, or will cover it in a very favorable light. If the page right next to the article about the damages to the drug of Pfizer is an advertisement for Pfizer, the marketing director at Pfizer just calls up the newspaper and says, hey, do you want to continue earning our funds or not? Because we don't like it that you put an article against our company right next to the ad that we just put alongside that. So that is the main reason. And here is just another example of how the media tend to lie and to obfuscate. This is just complete bullshit, right? I don't know if they did ask people to come in black or not, but in reality is possibly a majority or just a very large percentage of the people there were dressed in blue. But if the narrative or the propaganda is to make Trump look bad, then you'll say anything to accomplish that. And that's really what we saw here.
And several media outlets continued with that story and used the same photograph. Ultimately, it's like he said, they had to kind of try real hard to get the exact crop of the actual original photograph to be able to say that. And they knew full well that the whole narrative was false. And they still published it, because they just wanted to push that false narrative. And I think it's one thing when you make a journalistic error, when you misunderstand something or you make an honest mistake, but it's an entirely different thing when you're going out of your way to push a fake narrative. We know that happens in countries with state-run media, but it's even more disappointing when you see independent media, which is no longer independent, because it's like you mentioned with the air quotes, because they're getting their funding and their marching orders from advertisers, or as we've discovered now, from the government was pumping money in a roundabout way to a lot of news organizations to have them clearly stay in line with the narrative that the government was pushing. And that's something we would expect in a banana republic, but not here in the United States. Yet this is what we've discovered. Millions and millions of dollars going to what was supposed to be independent third-party news agencies that are supposed to report on the facts, not push a narrative, even worse, push a false narrative. So I just think Jeffrey does a great job in pointing that out and explaining it. And it's just an example. It's one simple example of an ongoing, unbelievable situation. Will we ever see a day where the media can really be trusted? Will we ever see a day where you don't have to really second guess everything? We have to second guess what the right food is. We have to second guess what the issues are with our medications. Why can't we we're all adults. Why can't we be told the truth? Okay. If someone wants to take a GLP1 and it might help them, let's make sure that the doctors and other prescribers are empowered to give the information, but the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the risks. And if you were willing to assume those risks, that's great. Same thing during the recent pandemic we had. People didn't have proper informed consent. They weren't given all the options. And I think that's why there's so much pushback. I think that's why there's so many different podcasts. That's why there's so many people now as independent journalists and citizen journalists out there trying to report news events throughout the world, because they're more credible. They have nobody that they're trying to please other than the people listening that they're trying to tell the truth to. Don't you agree?
Yeah, sometimes they may have advertisers as well, so it could become a vicious loop. Eventually, the big advertisers may move from the big media, which is no longer big media, into the small media, which is no longer small media. Who is the big media now? That's Joe Rogan, right? He is the biggest media out there. And as we haven't seen the drug companies fund the kind of podcast world yet, but still anybody who is funded by certain advertisements may have a bias towards them. Advertisers may have a bias towards them, but just the whole idea that the media is here to push narratives. We just saw again on another almost a completely separate topic, where obviously most people are familiar, and we've discussed in the past, Elon Musk and his work with the DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, along with the White House, to clear out so much waste and fraud and abuse we've seen in the United States government. And I've seen so many people who blow it away. It's just publicity. It's just bullshit. But they have a website and they post receipts for every single thing that they do, every single dollar that they save us. It has been remarkable. Their accomplishments have been remarkable. But recently, the stock of Tesla wasn't doing so well, and there were rumors that Elon is going to return back to Tesla, essentially leaving Doge, ditching Doge. And we saw a whole bunch of headlines on the topic, basically saying that there's a new rift between Elon and between Doge, and they're now enemies, and they hate each other. And Trump maybe appreciated Elon at the beginning, but now he's doing whatever he can to try and kick him out of the White House and get him away so that he can be free again, as if somehow Elon controls Trump, which is an absurd thing to think anyways. But in reality, anybody who's been following Elon for a while, and I've been following him for at least 15 years very closely, will know that this is Elon's MO, right? So when you run 5 or 6 or more different companies, it is very hard to do so and give a 100% attention to each company at any given time. It's physically impossible. So what Elon does is he comes to a company and then he focuses on it very deeply. Many times he'll have a 5-minute meeting basically with every single engineer in the company, important or unimportant. He wants to hear from everybody, and he'll drill down and question them at the very specifics of the engineering that they're working on and the dilemmas that they're facing. But he will go very in depth into something, and he'll understand the problems, the corruptions, the issues, the problems that it's facing, like we saw with X, right? Where when he took over X at the beginning, there were probably 3 to 6 months where he spent every single day, 20 hours a day in X, trying to solve the problems there, figure out the issues. The whole platform the code was crap and was falling apart, and everything there was basically falling apart. And obviously all the kind of monitoring of the population that we saw going on. When Elon came in, he spent 3 to 6 months there investigating, understanding everything, hiring the right people, putting the right people in place. And then when he felt that the new people and the new processes and procedures in the company are efficient and are good enough, then he's able to revert back to Tesla, to SpaceX, to Neuralink, to the Boring Company, and some of his other projects to focus on those as well. So we've seen a very similar thing occur with Doge, where Trump came into office and Doge was in full force, and Elon came in personally discovering a lot of these crimes, essentially robbery of the American people that was going on for many decades. And he was really in the width of it. But now that he's put really impressive people in place, like Joe Gebbia, the founder of Airbnb, and a whole bunch of very impressive CEOs and stuff who left the private world in order to come and save America, no less, and have been doing a phenomenal job at that. But now that there are the right people in place, the right processes in place, Elon can now move back and dedicate some of his time for each of his other companies. It's not that he's giving up on Doge completely, it's that he no longer has to focus on it 100% now that he's delegated the task to people he can trust. But the headlines would paint a picture that's the exact opposite. So David Sachs, who knows Elon very well and has been working very closely with the administration, he's the AI and crypto czar. He summarized this very well, which is basically what we've been saying. Even though the headlines may make it seem like there's this huge fight and rift between Elon and Trump, even though just recently Trump was asked about it and he just had praises to give to Elon, and same vice versa. Anybody who understands what's going on really understands that this is just the way Elon operates. He can't dedicate 100% of his time forever on Doge, no matter how important Doge is. He has all these other responsibilities, but now that there are people and processes in place, he can move back and focus his time elsewhere and just revisit this occasionally 1 or 2 days a week to make sure that things are progressing at a decent pace in the right direction. Do you have any thoughts on the matter?
Yeah, well, we put up from X a post by Mario Nawfal, and he basically reposts the David Sachs comment, which basically is Elon isn't leaving Doge, he's shifting to strategic management. And then he goes on to quote him. It's in the post where it says, I saw this before when I was part of the Twitter transition. For the first 3 months or so, he was basically full-time at Twitter HQ, learning the business down to the database level. Once he felt he had a mental model and he had the people in place that he trusted, he can move to more of a maintenance mode. he has these intense bursts where he focuses on something, gets the right people and structure in place, feels like he understands it, and then he can delegate more. So my sense is that DOGE is going to continue. It's just that Elon is shifting to a mode, he says, where he can manage it 1 day a week or 2 days a week, as opposed to being there 5 days a week. And the attribute of this comment is Stephen Mark Ryan and David Sachs. And it's posted on the screen for those that want to read it on YouTube and Rumble. And I think he's right. I think absolutely.
For anybody unfamiliar, this is a quote from the All In podcast. David Sachs is one of the 4 besties that started the All In podcast. There are 4 kind of self-made millionaires. Some of them are worth billionaires. Some of them are worth hundreds of millions, billions, but close enough. And so for anybody unfamiliar, Mario Nafal is a great person to follow on Twitter, X. He's originally Lebanese. I think he's Christian Lebanese. And he's basically like the #1 journalist on Twitter. He's very good at finding interesting stories and summarizing them, just like we saw here. In this one, he quotes Stephen Mark Ryan, who has a phenomenal YouTube channel called Solving the Money Problem. And he does an amazing analysis of Tesla and kind of everything Elon Musk. This particular David Sachs quote is from the All In podcast. Anybody unfamiliar, the All In is probably one of the best podcasts in the world on kind of business and entrepreneurship and the economy and just in general. It's made by 4 self-made billionaires. We quoted a few times in the past David Sachs, like we just mentioned earlier, and David Friedberg, who's brilliant kind of scientist as well, and Jason Calacanis, who's a phenomenal host. And the 4 of them are brilliant, and they each have really smart inputs. It's every time you hear somebody, yeah, I agree with that's really smart, and then the next person comes around and has something additional to add that's even more intelligent. And yeah, it's just a phenomenal podcast. And David Sachs is one of the original 4 besties. Nowadays that he's the crypto and AI czar in the White House, he hasn't been back regularly on the All In podcast, and they have guests instead, but he is one of the core 4. And in the past episode, he did show up, and this is a quote from him. Anybody who doesn't listen, that's a phenomenal listen. And anybody who wants to learn more about the Tesla world and any of Elon Musk's companies, Stephen Mark Ryan is Solving the Money Problem is a great YouTube channel on the subject as well. On to the next one. I think we have a funny clip of Schumer.
Yeah, so it speaks to the same, it's in the same vein, right? So how the media isn't always honest or straightforward, or they might pick and choose what they think is truthful, and it may be an outright lie, as in the headline with the crop picture. And politicians are known to often say things which they might mean one thing 1 minute, but if it applies to them, it might mean something different. Let's listen in and see. We think this is Chuck Schumer talking about polls and how Trump has some of the lowest 100-day polling ever, and he's really touting how important that is, and that you better follow the polls, and how important it is to listen to these polls, until it's not so important to listen to. Let's see what he has to say.
Polls this week show Trump has the lowest 100-day approval rating since they started polling 80 years ago. The lowest. Yes.
There's a poll out today that has your approval rating lower than any other congressional leader at 17%. Are you concerned that you may be a liability for your party?
Polls come and go. Our party is united. We're on our front foot. We're stepping forward and going after Trump and having real success.
Yeah, and for anybody... yeah, that's hysterical. And for anybody who didn't hear, the reporter basically asked Chuck Schumer right after he said that Trump has the worst polls in the first 100 days of any president. The reporter says, wait, aren't your polls at all-time lows for the kind of the leader of a party in Congress or in Senate? And he's, oh, polls don't matter. Polls don't matter. Yeah, like you prepped, it is just hysterical how what applies to thy may not apply to me.
He's the lowest of any congressional leader at 17%. And what does he do? He pivots to saying, oh, that's not important. We're going to be here. We're going to fight Trump. Again, it's just funny. And it's kudos to the reporter who asked that question and knew the poll. Look, polls have value. It's not that they have no value whatsoever. And I do believe that Chuck Schumer has the lowest polling of any congressional leader. It is what it is. But it just ends that theme. It doesn't matter if it's a drug ad. It doesn't matter if it's the media outright. It doesn't matter if it's our politicians. You don't always get the full and complete truth. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. And for the last story we have today, it's something to do with child trafficking, which is, of course, a horrible situation that happens extensively all over the world, but including the United States. And unfortunately, it seems like the US government was behind or connected to some of this child trafficking. Why don't you go ahead and show us the clip and give us a little bit of a commentary?
Sure. This is RFK Jr. that's going to be on this clip. And it went unnoticed, I think, by many people. But when you hear what he actually says, it's just shocking. We do know that over the last few years, there's been a massive amount. We're talking 300,000 children that were allowed to come into the country and disappeared. We have no idea where they went. And when under the Biden administration, there was some question as to what happened to these kids, the answer was they're handed off to another agency. We don't know anymore. We've stopped keeping track of them. And the reality is we have hundreds of thousands of children that have vanished. They may be foreign children. They may not have legal status, but they're missing. And they're somewhere. And there's a real concern that bad things are happening to them. And that's been the thought. And we also know, I spent 11 years living on the Mexican border in Texas, and I can tell you that there was always a question, because at times we had just adult males coming over by themselves, and then other times we'd have these kids coming with people that they were claiming were some uncle, cousin, something, but there was no evidence of that. They didn't even seem to know at times when they were questioned who the name is of the adult that was accompanying them. So they might have been paid to get them into the country, but then what happened to these kids? And there was always this fear that they were put into either some human trafficking sort of environment with sex or labor or what have you. And listen closely to what is admitted to here by RFK Jr. That's, to me, I mean, it's outrightly shocking. Let's go and listen.
We have ended HHS as the role as the vector, the principal vector in this country for child trafficking. And during the Biden administration, HHS became a collaborator in child trafficking and for sex and for slavery. And we have ended that, and we're very aggressively going out and trying to find these children, the 300,000 children that were lost by the Biden administration. And we are...
Yeah, that's utterly shocking, but also unsurprising. We've been knowing for years that hundreds of thousands of kids enter the United States and disappear. Many kids come with adults that claim to be their parents, but they're not their parents. It's very hard to identify when the policy of the U.S. government was, at least of the NGOs that worked for the U.S. government, was to tell all of these immigrants to discard their passports before coming into the border. So then the moment they enter, suddenly it's impossible to know who's related to who and who's not. And you have these adults claiming ownership over children. Are they really theirs? Who knows if the kids actually know them or not? And then many times these people are released into custody, and these children are released into custody into these many times vile humans' hands. Yeah, it's very sad and very scary. And it's good that finally we do have somebody directing the HHS who does care about it. Because to be honest, for years, it did seem there just was no care. And that's the saddest part.
Yeah, I'm going to add some context as well. When I lived on the border for all those years, I got to speak with a lot of people that worked in Homeland Security, people that were Border Patrol, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, local law enforcement and county law enforcement, state law enforcement, which were deputized at the federal level also. And the stories were just horrific. One of the things that happens is, even if it starts off innocently, that a parent in another country wants to give their child a chance to come to the United States and maybe have a better life, but can't come with them because they can't afford to. They can only send one person, so they send one of their children, their young minor children. And there's typically a debt to pay to the cartels, to the coyotes, to the human smugglers. And when they come into the country, these kids have nowhere to turn. And they're surrounded by adults that basically have physical control of them and threaten that if they don't cooperate, either something bad will happen to them, or something even worse may happen to their parents and siblings back home. And anyone that's familiar with what the cartels are capable of, including dismemberment and all these other things, the kids are petrified. They know to listen. And they're put as slaves, having to do what they're being told to do. And each and every day, they're reminded that if they don't cooperate, their whole family may be massacred back home. And they'll be sure that before their family gets injured and hurt and killed, they'll be reminded that their child is the one that caused this. So it's very easy to put these children in a position where they go along semi-willingly because they don't have a choice. And then who knows? Did the kids die? Are they buried somewhere? Who knows? It's a lot. We're talking a lot of kids. So the next clip, which really just puts a bow on this, has Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, the new Attorney General, and Kash Patel, the FBI Director. It's Kash who's actually speaking, but it's words that I think any parent would want to hear. And anyone that genuinely understands what's been going on for these years needs to at least celebrate that there appears to be something positive happening. That's a very tiny clip, but it basically is a press conference that's recognizing that they actually arrested about 205 child predators this week alone. That's a lot. And for all the movements over the past few years to try to make pedophiles an okay thing, they even renamed, or were attempting to rename that to minor attracted persons instead of calling them pedophiles. Bottom line is we should all be trying to protect our children and any children that we can protect. So let's play that clip real quick and put a little bow on this, but maybe recognize that things are going in the right direction.
Harshest criminality we've ever seen. They don't take breaks because our children deserve a free and open society. I also want to just take a moment to emphasize the priority of this Department of Justice and this FBI. Our children. If you harm our children, you will be given no sanctuary. There is no place we will not come to hunt you down. There is no place we will not look for you. And there is no cage we will not put you in should you do harm to our children. The prioritization of this administration and General Bondi has made it abundantly clear to child predators, you will be hunted down and you will be prosecuted. And that is a refreshing thing to hear for the men and women who do this work tirelessly. And it's also an acknowledgement of the safety that we look forward to bringing.
Yeah, and that's a great clip. What's important to remember as well is that the coyotes, or the cartels that smuggle people into the United States or take people across towards the border to the United States, these coyotes, that many of them help these migrants in different parts of the process, in different steps of the way geographically, but these are all cartels essentially, and on average they charge $10,000 to $20,000 per adult, per person, to smuggle these people into Mexico, and then across different parts of Mexico, and then into the United States. So let's say somebody does have the money and they come from Southeast Asia somewhere, right, Nepal, and they try to come into the United States and they save up for decades $20,000. Let's just say, which would be very hard for a Nepali person to do, but let's just say they save up $20,000 and then arrive in Mexico and they come to the first cartel and then they pay the first cartel what they owe him. But this is a cartel member. They're not just going to let somebody walk away with tens of thousands of dollars in their pocket. No, they're going to rob them for the rest. So let's just say they rob them for the rest. How do they continue arriving to the United States? How do they pay the other cartels during the remainder of their travels in order to enter the United States? How do they pay the final cartel that will smuggle them into the United States? And the answer is indentured servitude, which essentially means slaves without being slaves. Because the cartels now operate, at least were operating very freely over the past few years, especially around southern United States, but not just, these cartels would say, okay, no problem. We know you. We know who you are. Go ahead. Go into the United States. You'll owe us money and you'll pay interest. And you know how predatory that interest is. You'll owe us money for the rest of your lives, essentially, because with the interest, you'll never, ever be able to pay it back. So these people arrive in the United States and they may technically not be slaves. They may have a regular job, and they may be earning an okay money, an okay salary, which would theoretically be enough for them to sustain themselves in very minimal quality of life in the United States and maybe even send some money home. But in reality, all they're doing is paying back the 3 cartels that help smuggle them, who they owe money to. And these people live in a constant state of fear, and they're constantly being chased by these cartels. And every dollar that they have ends up going to paying back this debt that, like we said, the way the black market works, you can never really pay off in full because the cartel always wants you to be dependent on them. And that is somebody who does start with money, right? If you start with no money, then you're even more in trouble because you owe money to more cartels and more gangs and more problematic groups. So it is basically slavery without slavery. It's much better to allow people in, according to law, properly into the United States. Do we have a happy ending? Because I think there is one that is pretty amusing.
And it's just, again, to show politics can be fun. When you preach something as a politician, it's funny when someone takes it to the next level and goes whole hog on everything you've been saying and takes it 1,000% even stronger. The funniest part of the clip, for those listening and certainly for those watching even better, is the way that AOC handles this. I don't know if this was someone genuinely trolling her or someone with mental illness or what it was, but definitely if AOC was hoping to have someone that was completely on board with all of her policies and ideas and trying to save the planet, this woman definitely was trying to be a very good supporter and trying to jump with both hands and both feet on board the boat with AOC. So I think a good way, and I think as we listen to this, it's just, I think AOC met her match, the way I describe it, but I think it's just poetic justice for politicians when they're spewing a bunch of different ideas. Just be careful if someone actually believes your ideas. I don't know that the politicians always believe their own ideas. Here we go.
Going to be here for much longer because of the climate crisis. We only have a few months left. I love that you support the Green Deal, but it's not getting rid of fossil fuel. It's not going to solve the problem fast enough. A Swedish professor saying we can eat dead people, but that's not fast enough. So I think your next campaign slogan has to be this: we got to start eating babies. We don't have enough time. There's too much CO2. All of you, you're pollutant. Too much CO2. We have to start now, please. You are so great. I'm so happy that you're really supporting the Green Deal, but it's not enough. Even if we would bomb Russia, we still have too many people, too much pollution. So we have to get rid of the babies. That's a big problem. Just stopping having babies is not enough. We need to eat the babies, and this is very serious. Please give a response.
Thank you. No, thank you. Thank you. We'll go ahead. Okay. No, we'll go ahead. It's thank you. So I think so one of the things that's very important to us is that we need to treat the climate crisis with the urgency that it does present. Luckily, we have more than a few months. We do need to hit net zero in several years. But I think we all need to understand that there are a lot of solutions that we have and that we can pursue, and that if we act in a positive way, there's space for hope. We are never beyond hope. Okay.
She's become very optimistic on the climate crisis. I guess it's not as bad as she sometimes makes it out to be when she's out with Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, and apparently there are solutions. We know she used to drive a Tesla until she sold one in protest. So, and I think she bought some big gas guzzling SUV. So I don't know, maybe for caring for the environment, she should move back to her Tesla, but that would mean supporting Elon, and she obviously can't do that, even though it seems like she secretly wants babies from him. But yeah, it seems AOC kind of met her match with the women who want to eat their children. I assume jokingly, but I really hope so.
Yeah, I'm hoping it was just someone outrightly trolling her, but what the funny part was her reaction. She's trying to say, yeah, I get your point, but maybe that's a little too extreme, and the climate crisis isn't as bad as you're making it out to be, and we got hope and time and so forth. This was on C-SPAN, by the way, for those that weren't watching the video. So this is actually on public television, basically just airing. It looks like a town hall meeting. And but that's what happens when constituents actually believe everything the politicians say to them. They might take it to the next level.
And it's where this looks like it's straight out of Parks and Recreation. It really does.
It does. Right to jail. To jail. So I think it's a great way to end, just as a reminder. Maybe you should always listen to your politicians, to your experts and so forth, but perhaps maybe question or second guess some of the stuff and not jump in with both hands and both feet all the time.
And don't eat babies. We do not condone eating children.
Yeah, disclaimer, that is, we're not promoting any of that. So that's okay. But it was quite an unusual clip. And again, just it's worth, again, going to YouTube and looking at, or Rumble, and just watching AOC's face as she's trying to figure out how to handle this. And that was probably the most amusing part of it. But politics can be rough. It's not for everyone. So on that note, I guess this wraps up episode 10. And we'll be on to the next one soon enough. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. We really appreciate your attention. And please make sure to let us know what you think down in the comments.
See you soon.
Awesome. Bye, Joe.
Bye, Joe.